In the autumn of 1910, a quiet man in a grey suit stepped off a train in St. Louis, carrying a leather satchel full of blank forms. He was not a doctor. He had never practiced medicine in his life. His name was Abraham Flexner, and within the next 18 months, the decisions he made with that satchel would erase an entire branch of American medicine so completely that most people alive today have never heard it existed. Homeopathic colleges, eclectic medical schools, botanic institutes, naturopathic universities that once trained thousands of physicians a year, all across the United States. By the time Flexner was finished, more than half of them were gone, not slowly faded. Gone in less than a decade, closed, defunded, delicensed, and in some cases physically demolished. And the money behind his satchel did not come from the government. It came from two men who had no medical training at all, John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie. Tonight, we are going to walk through exactly what happened between 1900 and 1925, when American medicine had two competing futures, and one of them was bought out from under the other. We are going to look at the schools that vanished, the doctors who fought back and lost, the petroleum fortune that financed a war on plant medicine, and the question that still has no comfortable answer. Was this the rise of modern science saving Americans from quackery, or was it the quiet capture of an entire profession by men who also happened to own the patents on synthetic pharmaceuticals? If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is there. I always read the comments, and there is something strange and comforting about knowing someone in Manila is hearing this story at sunrise, while someone in Toronto is hearing it at midnight. All of us drifting into the same 100-year-old mystery together. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what American medicine actually looked like before 1910, because the picture taught in most schools today is almost the opposite of the truth. We are told a simple story. Before the Flexner Report, American medicine was dangerous, unregulated, full of charlatans selling snake oil out of covered wagons. And then, science arrived, just in time to save everyone. There is a kernel of truth buried in that story. There absolutely were dangerous quacks operating in 19th century America. Men with no training at all selling tonics made of nothing but alcohol and sugar water, promising cures for cancer and consumption. Nobody disputes that. But the story conveniently skips over something else entirely. By 1900, the United States had several fully developed, fully licensed, multi-year medical education systems that were not quackery at all. They had their own colleges, their own state board examinations, their own hospitals, their own peer-reviewed journals, and in many cases, better recorded patient outcomes for certain conditions than the conventional medical schools of the same era. The largest of these alternative systems was called eclectic medicine. The name sounds vague now, almost dismissive, but at its peak, the eclectic movement operated dozens of degree-granting colleges across the country, including a flagship institution in Cincinnati, Ohio, called the Eclectic Medical Institute, which had been training doctors since 1845. Eclectic physicians used botanical medicine, but they were not opposed to surgery or to using whatever tool worked. Their core philosophy was almost shockingly modern. Test everything, keep what works, discard dogma. They built their own pharmacology, documenting thousands of plant compounds with what they claimed were specific, repeatable physiological effects, decades before the pharmaceutical industry existed in anything like its modern form. Then there was homeopathy, a completely separate system built on the principle that extremely diluted substances could trigger the body's own healing response. We are not here tonight to settle the scientific argument over whether homeopathy works the way its founders claimed, because that argument still rages today, and we are not going to pretend we can resolve it in one video. What matters historically is that by 1900, homeopathic medicine was not a fringe practice in America. It was mainstream. There were 22 homeopathic medical colleges operating in the United States. Homeopathic hospitals existed in nearly every major city. Wealthy patients, including some of the most powerful families in the country, used homeopathic physicians as their primary doctors. The system had its own American Institute of Homeopathy, founded in 1844, making it older than the American Medical Association itself. And then there was naturopathy, a younger movement built around the idea that the human body had an innate capacity to heal itself if given the right conditions. Clean water, sunlight, fasting protocols, herbal support, and only minimal intervention. Naturopathic colleges were smaller in number but growing fast in the years just after 1900, and they drew on a deep well of immigrant medical traditions brought over from Germany and Central Europe, where natural healing movements had flourished for decades before crossing the Atlantic. What you need to hold in your mind right now, before we go any further, is this. These were not three fringe cults operating out of someone's basement. By the most conservative historical counts, somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4 practicing physicians in the United States in the year 1900 came from one of these alternative systems. That is not a footnote in medical history. That is a parallel medical establishment, fully licensed, fully credentialed, treating millions of American patients every single year. So what happened to all of it? The answer begins, strangely enough, not in a hospital or a medical college, but in a steel boardroom and an oil company office, because the men who would eventually decide the fate of American medicine were not doctors at all, they were industrialists. And in the early 1900s, both of them were facing a problem that had nothing to do with healthcare and everything to do with money. Andrew Carnegie had sold his steel empire in 1901 for nearly $500 million, an amount so large for that era that newspapers struggled to even describe it in comparable terms. He spent the rest of his life trying to figure out what to do with it, eventually deciding that organized, strategic philanthropy was the answer, and he founded the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching in 1905, specifically to fund large-scale studies of American education. John D. Rockefeller had built Standard Oil into the most dominant industrial monopoly the country had ever seen, so dominant that the federal government would break it apart in 1911 under antitrust law. But years before that breakup, Rockefeller had already begun building something else. A vast philanthropic infrastructure that would eventually include the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, founded in 1901, and later the Rockefeller Foundation itself, chartered in 1913. Here is where the story gets genuinely strange, because Rockefeller's involvement in medicine did not start with charity in the way we usually imagine charity. It started with a very specific, very personal relationship to a very specific kind of medicine. Frederick Taylor Gates, Rockefeller's closest religious and financial advisor, had been urging him for years to invest in what Gates called scientific medicine, by which he specifically meant laboratory-based, chemically focused, pharmaceutical-oriented medical research. Gates was not a doctor either. He was a former Baptist minister who had become fascinated with the emerging field of bacteriology after reading a textbook on the subject almost by accident in 1897. He brought that fascination directly to Rockefeller, and Rockefeller, who had already built his fortune on petroleum, found something deeply appealing about a model of medicine built on isolating, synthesizing, and patenting specific chemical compounds. It was, in a very real sense, an industrial model of medicine, the same kind of standardized, scalable, ownable production process that had made Standard Oil the most powerful company on earth. This is the part of the story that the official histories tend to soften, and it deserves to be said plainly. The same years Rockefeller's General Education Board began funding medical reform, his Standard Oil subsidiaries were deep in the business of refining petroleum byproducts, and many of those same petrochemical byproducts would become the foundational building blocks for the synthetic pharmaceutical industry over the following decades. Coal tar derivatives, petroleum distillates, the raw chemical inputs for an entire new category of patentable, synthesizable drugs that simply could not be derived from whole plants picked in a field. A medical system built around plant compounds that anyone could grow in a garden was, by its very nature, difficult to patent and almost impossible to monopolize. A medical system built around synthesized chemical compounds, refined in a laboratory from petroleum derivatives, was the opposite. It was patentable. It was scalable. It was, in the most literal sense, an extension of the same industrial logic that had built Standard Oil in the first place. Was this a deliberate, conscious plan from day one, a boardroom conspiracy where men sat around a table and said, "Let us destroy the natural medicine schools so we can sell more petroleum derivative drugs"? The honest answer, the answer any careful historian has to give, is that we do not have a smoking gun document that says exactly that. What we have instead is something almost more interesting. We have a pattern of incentives, decisions, and outcomes that all point in the same direction, made by men who had every financial reason to want that direction, executed through institutions that those same men controlled completely. Whether that constitutes a conspiracy or simply an extraordinarily convenient alignment of self-interest and ideology depends entirely on how skeptical you are willing to be. And by the end of tonight's story, you will have all the pieces in front of you to decide for yourself, because here is what we know for certain happened next. In 1908, the Carnegie Foundation, working closely with the American Medical Association's Council on Medical Education, decided to commission a comprehensive survey of every medical school in the United States and Canada. The man they chose to conduct this survey was Abraham Flexner, and the choice of Flexner himself is one of the strangest, most overlooked details in this entire story, because Abraham Flexner was, by his own admission, not a physician. He held no medical degree. He had never treated a patient. He had spent his career as an educator, running a private secondary school in Louisville, Kentucky. His only connection to medicine at all was his brother, Simon Flexner, who happened to be the founding director of none other than the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. That single family connection sat at the center of everything that followed. Simon Flexner's Rockefeller Institute was, by 1908, already the leading edge of laboratory-based, chemically focused American medical research, the exact model of medicine that Frederick Gates had spent a decade convincing Rockefeller to fund. So when the Carnegie Foundation needed someone to travel the country and judge which medical schools deserved to survive, the man they selected was the brother of the director of the single most powerful laboratory medicine institute in America, an institute built entirely on Rockefeller money. Abraham Flexner did not arrive in any city as a neutral observer. He arrived already believing, deeply and sincerely, that laboratory-based medicine was the only legitimate form of medicine, and that anything built around plant compounds, dilution principles, or natural healing belonged to a vanishing, unscientific past. Over roughly 18 months, Flexner visited all 155 medical schools, then operating in the United States and Canada. He did not bring a team of physicians to evaluate clinical outcomes. He did not review patient survival statistics. He walked into each school, often for no more than a single day, sometimes less, and assessed it almost entirely on physical infrastructure. Did the school have a fully equipped chemistry laboratory built to the standard of a research university? Did it have a dissection room stocked with cadavers? Did its faculty hold advanced laboratory science credentials, the kind earned at places like Johns Hopkins, which not coincidentally had become the flagship model Flexner held up as the gold standard throughout his entire report, and which had itself been substantially shaped by the same emerging laboratory medicine philosophy that the Rockefeller orbit was already funding? Here is the detail that should make you sit up even half asleep. Flexner's entire ranking system measured schools almost exclusively by how much they resembled Johns Hopkins, not by how many patients they successfully treated. Not by how many of their graduates went on to long, safe careers healing real people in real towns, by laboratory square footage, by faculty research credentials, by the presence of microscopes and centrifuges and dissection theaters. A small, eclectic college in rural Ohio that trained competent botanical physicians who had treated frontier families for 40 years with documented success could be rated as deficient simply because it lacked a research chemistry wing-it. Never needed and never claimed to need. Meanwhile, schools that fit the laboratory model, regardless of their actual clinical track record, were rated as excellent. The report Flexner produced, formally titled Medical Education in the United States and Canada, was published in 1910 under the imprint of the Carnegie Foundation. It ran nearly 350 pages, and its language toward the alternative medical colleges was not measured academic prose. It was closer to public execution. Flexner described homeopathic colleges as institutions that had, in his words, no claim to recognition of any kind. He called many of the smaller proprietary medical schools, regardless of specialty, diploma mills, regardless of whether they actually held legitimate state charters and licensing authority. He recommended, in writing, that the vast majority of America's 155 medical schools simply cease to exist, proposing that the country needed no more than 31 medical schools in total to serve the entire population. 31 out of 155. That is not reform. That is the deliberate, documented elimination of 80% of an entire nation's medical training infrastructure, decided by one man with no medical degree, in 18 months, funded by two industrialists who had never practiced medicine a single day in their lives. and the report did not stay on a shelf gathering dust the way most policy documents do. It became a weapon almost immediately, because the moment it was published, the institutions that controlled American medical licensing began using it as their operating manual. State licensing boards, increasingly influenced by the American Medical Association, started revoking accreditation from schools the Flexner Report had condemned. And here is where Rockefeller's money stopped being theoretical and started becoming directly operational. Through the General Education Board, an organization Rockefeller had founded in 1902 and funded with what would eventually total more than $100 million, an almost incomprehensible sum for that era, Rockefeller began making direct, targeted grants to the medical schools that survived Flexner's purge, while offering nothing at all to the ones that did not. If you were a laboratory-based, allopathic medical school willing to restructure your curriculum around the Johns Hopkins model, Rockefeller money could rebuild your entire campus. If you were a homeopathic or eclectic college, there was no call, no letter, no offer of partnership. There was only silence and a slow, deliberate financial starvation. Picture the position those schools were suddenly in. Many of them were not wealthy institutions to begin with. They ran on tuition, on small endowments, on local community support. They were never going to be able to compete, on laboratory infrastructure alone, with a school that had just received the equivalent of tens of millions of modern dollars from the richest man on earth. It would be like asking a small family bakery to compete with a factory that just received an unlimited line of credit from a central bank. The competition was not really competition at all. It was a foregone conclusion built into the structure of the money itself. The Eclectic Medical Institute in Cincinnati, the flagship of the entire eclectic movement, the school that had trained physicians since 1845, limped along for another 2 decades under increasing financial and regulatory pressure before finally closing its doors for good in 1939. Of the 22 homeopathic medical colleges operating in the United States in 1900, only 2 remained open by 1923. 2. In 23 years, an entire parallel system of medical education that had operated for more than half a century, with its own hospitals, its own state licenses, its own professional associations, had been reduced to almost nothing. Naturopathic colleges fared even worse in most states, facing direct legislative campaigns, often supported by state medical societies aligned with the American Medical Association, to strip naturopaths of any legal right to diagnose or treat patients at all, regardless of training or experience. Now, if you are the kind of person who instinctively distrusts a story this clean, you are asking exactly the right question, and we are going to sit with it for a while, because the honest answer is more complicated than either side of this argument usually admits. The defenders of the Flexner Report, and there are serious, credentialed medical historians who defend it to this day, will tell you that this was not a conspiracy at all, but a desperately needed correction. They will point out, correctly, that medical education in 1900 really was wildly inconsistent. Some schools, across every category, including plenty of conventional allopathic schools, really were diploma mills handing out medical degrees after a few months of barely supervised lectures to anyone who could pay the tuition. They will point out that germ theory had only become broadly accepted within the prior few decades, that antiseptic surgical practice was still spreading unevenly across the country, and that some genuine reform of medical training was, by any reasonable standard, overdue. They will argue that Rockefeller and Carnegie's money, whatever its underlying motivations, did produce real and lasting improvements. Standardized curricula, required laboratory training, far more rigorous licensing examinations, lower rates of certain kinds of preventable surgical infection in hospitals that adopted the new standards. All of that is true, and we are not going to pretend it is not true just because it complicates the story. But here is what that defense conveniently fails to explain, and it is the detail that keeps this story alive in the public imagination more than a century later. If the goal had genuinely, purely been about raising the floor of medical competence and patient safety, the obvious solution would have been to apply rigorous, consistent standards equally across every system of medicine, allopathic, homeopathic, eclectic, and naturopathic alike, and let each tradition rise or fall on whether its practitioners could meet those standards using their own methods. Demand real laboratories, real licensing exams, real clinical training from everyone. Instead, what actually happened was that an entire philosophical category of medicine anything built around whole plant compounds and non-synthetic interventions was treated as inherently illegitimate from the very first page of the report, regardless of how rigorous any individual eclectic or homeopathic school's training actually was. The bias was not against bad schools. The bias was against an entire category of medical thought, a category that, not coincidentally, could never be patented, monopolized, or sold at industrial scale the way a synthesized chemical compound could. Let's go back, then, and meet some of the people whose lives and careers were actually caught inside this machinery. Because it is very easy to talk about institutions and foundations and reports in the abstract, and very easy to forget that every single one of these closures had a human face attached to it. Real physicians who had spent decades building practices, real patients who suddenly lost access to the kind of medicine they trusted, real towns where the only doctor for 50 miles in any direction had trained at a school that no longer existed and could no longer be licensed. Consider the situation facing a young, eclectic physician graduating from the Eclectic Medical Institute in Cincinnati in the years right after the Flexner Report was published. He had completed a rigorous, multi-year course of study. He had passed his state licensing examination under the laws that existed when he enrolled. He had every legal right to practice medicine in his state. And then, within a few short years, he watched the rules change underneath him. State after state began tightening licensing reciprocity, making it harder and harder for eclectic and homeopathic graduates to register in new states, to renew certain hospital privileges, to be taken seriously by an insurance industry that was itself beginning to align with the new allopathic standard. Some of these physicians simply continued practicing in the towns where they had always practiced, grandfathered in under older laws, beloved by patients who had trusted them for years. But the pipeline behind them, the next generation of eclectic trained doctors who would have replaced them, was being shut off college by college, year by year, until eventually there was no pipeline left at all. This is, in many ways, the most quietly devastating part of the entire story, and it is the part almost nobody talks about. You do not need to burn down every existing eclectic doctor's office to kill an entire system of medicine. You only need to close the schools that train the next generation. The existing doctors simply age, retire, and die, exactly the way every generation eventually does, and there is no one behind them to take their place. Within 30 or 40 years, an entire medical tradition that had once been a fully credentialed, fully legal, mainstream option for 1 in 5 American patients had simply ceased to exist, not because it was outlawed in a single dramatic stroke, but because its educational pipeline was strangled at the source, and time did the rest of the work on its own. There is a particular irony buried inside this story that deserves its own moment, because it involves the very same family whose name sits in tonight's title. Decades before John D. Rockefeller became the great patron of laboratory-based, allopathic, chemically focused medicine, his own mother, Eliza Davison Rockefeller, was a devoted user of homeopathic medicine for her family, and young John D. himself was raised, in significant part, under homeopathic medical care. There are biographical accounts describing how Rockefeller, even well into his later decades as the wealthiest man in the world, maintained a personal homeopathic physician for his own private health needs, even as the institutions bearing his name were systematically defunding homeopathic education for everyone else. Whether this reflects simple personal habit, a deep private skepticism about the very system he was publicly funding, or something more complicated about how the wealthy have always reserved certain privileges for themselves while restructuring the world for everyone beneath them, is a question we cannot answer with full certainty. But it sits there in the historical record, an uncomfortable little detail that refuses to resolve cleanly in either direction. Now, let's widen the lens for a moment, because the story of natural medicine in America did not begin with eclectic colleges in the 1840s, and to understand what these systems actually represented, what was actually at stake when they were systematically dismantled, we need to go back much further, to the medical knowledge that existed on this continent long before any European medical school, conventional or alternative, ever opened its doors, because the deepest, oldest layer of natural medicine in North America was not European at all. It was indigenous. For thousands of years before Columbus ever set foot on a Caribbean beach, the indigenous peoples of North America had developed botanical medical traditions of staggering sophistication, traditions built not on guesswork but on countless generations of careful, repeated observation, passed down through oral instruction from healer to apprentice, refined and corrected across centuries the way any genuine body of empirical knowledge eventually is. Modern ethnobotanists who have spent careers cataloguing these traditions consistently arrive at the same humbling conclusion. Many indigenous nations across the continent possess detailed, accurate knowledge of literally hundreds of medicinal plant species, knowledge that included not just which plants treated which conditions, but precise information about dosage, about seasonal harvesting windows when a plant's active properties were strongest, about preparation methods that could mean the difference between a healing tea and a dangerous poison. The Cherokee, in what is now the southeastern United States, maintained an extraordinarily detailed pharmacopoeia built around plants like golden seal, used for digestive ailments and as a topical treatment for skin conditions, and black cohosh, used specifically for women's reproductive health in ways that modern herbal medicine still recognizes today. The Iroquois Confederacy, spanning what is now upstate New York, developed sophisticated protocols using witch hazel as an astringent and anti-inflammatory, a plant whose extract you can still buy in nearly any American pharmacy today, sitting quietly on a shelf, its origin story almost entirely scrubbed from public memory. Lakota and other Plains nations developed deep knowledge of echinacea, the purple coneflower, using it to support the body's response to infection, a use that herbalists and increasingly some conventional researchers continue to study and validate well into the 21st century. What is remarkable, and what almost never gets discussed honestly in conventional American history education, is how much of this indigenous botanical knowledge was directly absorbed into early European American colonial medicine, often without acknowledgement, often through relationships that range from genuine collaborative exchange to outright extraction. Early colonial settlers, arriving in a continent full of plants they had never encountered in Europe, frequently survived their first brutal years in no small part because indigenous communities shared knowledge of which local plants were edible, which were medicinal, and which were lethal. This knowledge transfer is documented in colonial journals, missionary records, and the early botanical surveys conducted by settlers who, to their credit, recognized they were standing in front of a pharmacy more sophisticated than anything they had brought with them from Europe. By the time the eclectic medical movement formalized itself in the 1840s, a significant portion of its core botanical pharmacology had roots tracing directly back to this indigenous knowledge base, filtered and adapted through generations of colonial and early American herbal practice. The eclectics did not invent the idea that specific plants had specific, reliable physiological effects on the human body. They inherited that idea, however imperfectly and however much credit was lost along the way, from a continent that had already been practicing sophisticated botanical medicine for thousands of years before any European medical theory arrived on these shores. This matters enormously for understanding the full scope of what was lost in 1910 and the years that followed, because the destruction of eclectic, homeopathic, and naturopathic medical education was not simply the closing of a few dozen 19th century colleges. It was, in a very real sense, the final institutional severing of a knowledge lineage that stretched back, however indirectly, through centuries of accumulated indigenous botanical science. When the last eclectic college closed its doors in 1939, it was not only the end of a movement that began in 1845, it was the quiet conclusion of a much longer story, one that had been losing ground for centuries through disease, displacement, and the systematic destruction of indigenous communities themselves, and which finally lost its last formal foothold in mainstream American medical licensing in the early decades of the 20th century. There is a deeper, even more unsettling layer to this part of the story, one that takes us back before 1910, before the Flexner Report, before Rockefeller and Carnegie had built their fortunes at all, to a question that historians and indigenous scholars alike continue to wrestle with today. How much indigenous medical knowledge, how many plant compounds with documented healing properties, how many entire pharmacological traditions were lost forever during the centuries of disease, forced relocation, and violence that decimated indigenous populations across North America following European contact? We will never have a precise number, because the nature of oral knowledge transmission means that when a tradition's last keepers die, without passing their knowledge forward, that knowledge simply vanishes, leaving no written record, no patent filing, no medical journal article, nothing but silence where there was once a living, functioning system of healing. Some estimates, drawn from comparing the documented medicinal plant knowledge of surviving indigenous communities, against the much larger number of distinct indigenous nations and language groups that existed across North America before 1492, suggests that what has survived and been documented may represent only a fraction, perhaps as little as a third, of the total botanical medical knowledge that once existed on this continent. If that estimate is even roughly accurate, it means that the natural medicine systems eventually consolidated into movements like eclecticism and early American herbalism, the very systems Rockefeller and Carnegie's foundations would later work to dismantle, were themselves already operating with only a partial inheritance of a much vaster, much older body of knowledge that had already been substantially eroded before it ever had the chance to be formally documented at all. Let's bring the lens back to 1910 now, and look more closely at the actual mechanics of how a medical school dies, because it is worth understanding this process in granular detail, not just as an abstract historical outcome, but as a lived, multi-step sequence of events that unfolded in dozens of cities across America, often following nearly identical patterns, almost as though there were a playbook being applied uniformly from coast to coast. The first step was always the same: a negative Flexner rating, published in the 1910 report itself, or in subsequent follow-up surveys conducted under the same Carnegie Foundation framework throughout the 1910s. A school would receive a grade, often expressed in blunt terms like acceptable, doubtful, or unacceptable, and that single word, decided by Flexner's brief site visit, would begin circulating through state licensing boards, through the American Medical Association's own publications, through local newspapers covering education and public health. The reputational damage happened almost instantly. Prospective students, reading these reports, would simply choose to enroll elsewhere, at one of the schools Flexner had blessed with a favorable rating. Enrollment at the condemned schools would begin dropping within a single academic year. The second step followed close behind. State legislatures, lobbied heavily by state chapters of the American Medical Association, which had explicitly adopted promotion of the Flexner standards as one of its core institutional missions throughout the 1910s and 1920s, began revising medical licensing statutes. These revisions frequently included new requirements specifying minimum laboratory hours, minimum clinical rotation requirements modeled directly on the Johns Hopkins curriculum, and increasingly stringent definitions of what kind of institution even qualified as an accredited medical college in the eyes of the state. Schools that could not afford to rapidly build new laboratory facilities, often because they had just lost a significant portion of their incoming enrollment and tuition revenue in Step 1, found themselves unable to meet these new legal requirements within the transition windows the legislatures provided, typically only a handful of years. The third step was financial starvation, and this is where Rockefeller's General Education Board became the single most decisive actor in the entire story. Between 1910 and the early 1930s, the General Education Board distributed well over $50 million directly to American medical schools, an amount so large for the era that it fundamentally reshaped the financial landscape of medical education nationwide, but every dollar of it went exclusively to schools that had embraced or were willing to rapidly restructure toward the laboratory-based allopathic model Flexner had endorsed. Johns Hopkins itself received enormous direct Rockefeller funding throughout this period, continuing to deepen its position as the flagship model for the entire system. Vanderbilt University's medical school was substantially rebuilt with Rockefeller funding in the 1920s, explicitly restructured to abandon its prior, more eclectic curricular elements in favor of the full laboratory model. Schools willing to make this transition received the capital to survive and grow. Schools unwilling or unable to abandon their founding philosophical traditions, the homeopathic colleges built around dilution principles, the eclectic colleges built around whole-plant botanical pharmacology, received nothing. The fourth and final step was simple attrition. A school facing collapsing enrollment, tightening legal requirements it could not afford to meet, and zero access to the philanthropic capital reshaping every competing institution around it, had essentially one option left: close. Sometimes this happened through formal merger, where a struggling homeopathic or eclectic college would be absorbed into a larger conventional university, with its distinct curriculum and faculty quietly dissolved into the host institution's standard allopathic program. The merger announced in respectful, even celebratory language about modernization and progress, while the actual effect was the permanent erasure of an entire educational tradition. Other times, the closure was simply final. The doors locked, the buildings sold, the faculty scattered to find work wherever conventional medical institutions might still have a place for them. By 1925, 15 years after the Flexner Report's publication, the numbers tell a story more stark than almost any other transformation in the history of American professional education. The country had gone from 155 medical schools in 1910 to roughly 76. Of the alternative medicine schools specifically, homeopathic, eclectic, naturopathic, and the various smaller botanic medical traditions combined, the survival rate was even more brutal than the overall numbers suggest, because nearly the entire reduction in total school count came disproportionately from this category. The conventional allopathic schools that survived Flexner's purge did not simply outcompete their alternative medicine peers in some neutral marketplace of ideas. They survived because they were the only schools eligible for the capital that determined survival in the first place. There is a particular institution whose story deserves to be told in detail, because it captures the human cost of this transformation more vividly than any aggregate statistic ever could. The Hahnemann Medical College of Philadelphia, named after Samuel Hahnemann, the German physician who founded homeopathic medicine in the late 18th century, was once among the most respected and academically rigorous homeopathic institutions in the entire country. By the 1890s, Hahnemann Medical College had built an extensive teaching hospital, trained thousands of practicing physicians, and maintained a reputation for clinical excellence that drew students from across the eastern seaboard. Its faculty published actively in homeopathic medical journals, conducted what they considered rigorous clinical observation of patient outcomes, and saw themselves not as practitioners of a fringe alternative, but as the inheritors of a distinct, internally coherent medical science with its own internal logic and its own evidentiary standards. When the Flexner Report arrived, Hahnemann faced the same impossible choice confronting every homeopathic institution in the country. Abandon the foundational philosophical principles that defined the school's entire identity and purpose, restructuring entirely around the allopathic laboratory model in order to remain eligible for accreditation and funding, or maintain its founding traditions and watch state licensing recognition, student enrollment, and institutional funding all collapse simultaneously. Hahnemann chose survival through transformation. Over the following decades, the college gradually, painfully, shed nearly all of its original homeopathic curriculum, restructuring itself into a conventional allopathic medical school in order to remain accredited and operational. The institution itself survived, in name, for many more decades, eventually becoming part of Drexel University's medical school in the modern era. But the homeopathic medical science that Hahnemann Medical College had once existed specifically to teach and advance did not survive that transformation. It was not preserved within the surviving institution. It was excised from it, deliberately and completely, as the price of institutional survival. This pattern repeated itself, with only minor variation, at homeopathic and eclectic institutions across the entire country. Survival, when it happened at all, almost always required the complete abandonment of the very medical philosophy the institution had been founded to teach and preserve. In the starkest possible sense, the institutions survived while the medicine died inside them, hollowed out and replaced with the approved curriculum, leaving only a name and a campus as the visible remnant of what had once been there. Now, consider the role of the American Medical Association itself throughout this entire period, because the AMA was not a passive observer, watching Flexner's report reshape the medical landscape from a comfortable distance. The AMA's own Council on Medical Education had actively collaborated with the Carnegie Foundation in commissioning the Flexner survey in the first place, and throughout the 1910s and 1920s, the AMA used its growing institutional authority over state licensing boards to aggressively enforce the Flexner standards as the only acceptable baseline for legitimate medical practice. State medical societies, AMA-affiliated organizations operating at the local level in every state in the country, lobbied state legislatures relentlessly throughout this period, pushing for stricter licensing requirements that disproportionately targeted homeopathic, eclectic, and naturopathic practitioners, often using language in legislative testimony that framed these entire traditions, regardless of any individual practitioner's actual training or clinical competence, as inherently dangerous to public health. It would be historically dishonest to claim the AMA's motivations were purely or even primarily financial. because there is no question that many physicians within the organization sincerely believed, with complete intellectual honesty, that laboratory-based medicine represented genuine scientific progress over botanical and dilution-based systems they considered scientifically unfounded. But it would be equally dishonest to ignore the economic dimension sitting plainly visible underneath the scientific debate. Every homeopathic, eclectic, or naturopathic physician practicing in a community represented a competitor for patients, for hospital privileges, for the growing professional and financial status that came with being recognized as a legitimate physician in early 20th century America. The AMA's aggressive consolidation of licensing authority during this exact period served the interests of its own membership in a very direct, very material way, regardless of how sincerely individual members believed in the scientific merits of the laboratory model. Self-interest and sincere belief are not mutually exclusive, and untangling exactly how much of each was operating inside any single physician's mind in 1915 is simply not possible from the historical record we have access to today. What we can say with confidence is this. The American Medical Association emerged from this period as dramatically more powerful, more centralized, and more financially secure than it had ever been before, having successfully eliminated the majority of its organized professional competition through a combination of reputational warfare, legislative lobbying, and alignment with the single largest source of medical philanthropic capital in the country. Whether you call that the triumph of scientific medicine or the consolidation of a professional monopoly likely depends less on the historical facts themselves, which are well documented and not seriously disputed by historians across the ideological spectrum, and more on what assumptions you bring into the room about whether institutional power and scientific truth reliably travel together. While the natural medicine colleges were dying, something else was being born in parallel, and understanding this parallel birth is essential to understanding why so many people, then and now, suspect there was more at work here than disinterested scientific reform. The American pharmaceutical industry, in anything resembling its modern form, did not really exist before the early 20th century. Most medicines throughout the 19th century were compounded directly by pharmacists or physicians themselves, often from botanical sources, with no centralized industrial manufacturing process and no system of exclusive patent protection on the medicines themselves. The shift toward an industrial pharmaceutical model, built around synthesized chemical compounds manufactured at scale in centralized factories and protected by patent law, happened almost exactly in step with the consolidation of laboratory-based medicine that the Flexner Report had championed. Companies like Merck, Pfizer, and Eli Lilly, all of which existed in some form before 1910, but operated at relatively modest scale compared to what they would become, expanded dramatically throughout the 1910s and 1920s, precisely the same years that homeopathic and eclectic medical education was collapsing. This expansion was not simply a coincidence of timing. The new generation of physicians being trained under the Flexner reformed curriculum were being educated almost exclusively within a paradigm that treated pharmaceutical intervention, specifically synthesized chemical compounds developed and patented by an increasingly industrialized pharmaceutical sector, as the primary legitimate tool of medical practice. Medical schools that received Rockefeller funding increasingly incorporated direct relationships with pharmaceutical companies into their research programs, relationships that would only deepen and formalize over the following decades into the kind of pharmaceutical industry-funded medical research infrastructure that remains the dominant model in American medical research to this day. Consider the financial logic sitting underneath this entire transition, because it is genuinely instructive, regardless of how you ultimately judge the motivations involved. A plant compound, something like the foxglove plant from which digitalis is derived, or the willow bark from which aspirin's active compound was first isolated, cannot typically be patented in its natural form because patent law generally does not allow ownership claims over substances that occur naturally and have been used by humans for generations prior to any individual's claimed discovery. But once a pharmaceutical company isolates, purifies, and chemically modifies that same compound into a synthesized version, even one with only marginally different chemical properties, that synthesized version often becomes eligible for patent protection, granting the company that developed it exclusive manufacturing and sales rights for a period of years, during which competitors are legally barred from producing the same compound. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is simply how pharmaceutical patent law has functioned in the United States for more than a century, and it created an enormous structural financial incentive, favoring synthesized chemical medicine over whole plant botanical medicine that had nothing to do with which approach actually produced better patient outcomes and everything to do with which approach could generate a defensible, exclusive revenue stream for the company that developed it. A medical education system built primarily around training physicians to diagnose conditions and then prescribe patentable, synthesized pharmaceutical compounds was, whether by deliberate design or convenient alignment of interests, extraordinarily good business for the emerging pharmaceutical industry. A medical education system built around training physicians to prescribe whole plant compounds that any patient could theoretically grow in a garden, or homeopathic remedies built on principles that resisted the entire patent and manufacturing logic of industrial pharmaceuticals altogether, offered almost no comparable commercial opportunity. The men who funded the destruction of one system and the simultaneous construction of the other were not simply wealthy philanthropists with an abstract interest in scientific progress. They were industrialists who had built their fortunes by recognizing exactly this kind of structural commercial opportunity in other industries, and who brought the same pattern recognition to the question of how American medicine itself might be organized and, crucially, who might profit from organizing it. Let's pause here and meet one of the physicians who refused to go quietly, because the story of this period is not only one of institutional collapse, but also of individual resistance. And some of that resistance came from genuinely remarkable people whose names deserve to be remembered even though history has mostly forgotten them. Dr. Finley Ellingwood was one of the most prominent eclectic physicians of the early 20th century, a professor at the Eclectic Medical College in Chicago, and the author of an extraordinarily detailed multi-volume work on botanical pharmacology, cataloging the physiological effects of hundreds of medicinal plants with the same systematic rigor that any contemporary scientific researcher would recognize as legitimate empirical methodology. Ellingwood spent the final decades of his career right through the years when the Flexner Report was reshaping the entire landscape around him, continuing to publish detailed clinical case studies documenting specific botanical treatments and their outcomes in real patients, building an evidentiary record that he clearly hoped would eventually force mainstream medicine to take eclectic pharmacology seriously on its own scientific terms. Ellingwood watched, in real time, as the institutional ground shifted beneath the entire profession he had dedicated his life to. He continued teaching at the Chicago College even as its accreditation status grew increasingly precarious, even as enrollment declined year after year, even as the broader public conversation around medicine increasingly treated everything he taught as a relic of a less scientific past. He died in 1920, a decade after the Flexner Report's publication, having spent his final years watching the systematic dismantling of the very system of medical education and practice he had spent his entire career building and defending. His multi-volume pharmacological texts, remarkably, were never entirely forgotten. They survived in rare book collections and in the personal libraries of the dwindling number of practicing herbalists and naturopaths who kept eclectic botanical knowledge alive in increasingly marginalized corners of American alternative medicine throughout the mid-20th century, decades during which this knowledge had no formal institutional home, no accredited college, no licensing pathway, surviving instead almost entirely through informal apprenticeship and underground transmission from one practitioner to the next. There is something genuinely moving in tracing how certain pieces of this knowledge survived the institutional collapse entirely outside the formal system that had once housed them. Herbalism in America did not disappear in 1939 when the last eclectic college closed. It simply went underground, surviving in rural communities, in immigrant healing traditions that had never been part of the formal eclectic or homeopathic college system in the first place, in the kitchens and gardens of grandmothers who had learned plant medicine from their own grandmothers, and who never needed a medical license to grow chamomile or echinacea in a backyard garden and share it with a sick neighbor. The institutional infrastructure was destroyed almost completely, but the underlying knowledge proved more resilient than the colleges that had once formally codified and taught it, surviving in fragments, scattered and unlicensed, waiting for a cultural moment when interest in natural and herbal medicine would eventually re-emerge. That re-emergence did eventually come, though it took the better part of half a century. Beginning in the 1960s and 1970s, a renewed countercultural interest in natural healing, herbalism, And what would eventually be rebranded as holistic and integrative medicine began slowly rebuilding some of the institutional infrastructure that had been destroyed decades earlier. New naturopathic colleges were founded. Acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine, an entirely separate tradition with its own complicated history of suppression and revival in both China and the West, gained increasing recognition and licensing in various American states. Herbal medicine experienced a significant commercial and cultural revival, eventually growing into a multi-billion-dollar supplement industry, though one operating under a regulatory framework established by the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of 1994 that treats herbal products fundamentally differently from pharmaceutical drugs, generally prohibiting specific medical claims and requiring far less rigorous proof of efficacy than pharmaceutical approval, a regulatory asymmetry that itself echoes, in a different form, the same underlying tension between patentable synthesized medicine and unpatentable natural compounds that shaped the entire Flexner-era story. It is worth pausing here to consider what happened internationally during this same period, because the American experience was not universal, and the contrast tells us something important about how much of this outcome was driven by specifically American institutional and financial conditions, rather than by some inevitable global march of scientific progress that simply happened to arrive in medicine during these decades. In Germany, homeopathic medicine never experienced anything resembling the institutional collapse it suffered in the United States. German universities continued offering homeopathic medical training throughout the 20th century, and to this day, Germany maintains a far more integrated relationship between conventional and homeopathic medicine than the United States does, with many German pharmacies stocking homeopathic remedies alongside conventional pharmaceuticals as a matter of routine practice, and with homeopathic treatment still covered, at least partially, by aspects of the German health insurance system in various periods since. In India, the government formally recognized and continues to fund an entire parallel system of medical education and licensing for what is known as Ayush medicine, an acronym covering Ayurveda, Yoga, Unani, Siddha, and homeopathy, with dedicated government ministries, dedicated medical colleges, and a formal licensing pathway that operates alongside, rather than in competition with, conventional allopathic medical licensing. A patient in India today can legally and openly choose to be treated by an Ayurvedic physician with a recognized government-issued medical degree, train in a multi-year program every bit as institutionally formal as the eclectic and homeopathic colleges that once existed across America before 1910. The system that was destroyed in the United States in the early 20th century was never destroyed in India at all, and continues operating as a parallel, government-sanctioned medical tradition serving hundreds of millions of patients to this day. This international contrast does not, by itself, prove that the American outcome was the result of a deliberate financial conspiracy rather than a legitimate, if perhaps overly aggressive, scientific reform movement. Different countries have different histories, different relationships between government, industry, and medicine, and different cultural attitudes toward traditional healing practices that long predate the 20th century reforms in any of them. But it does demonstrate something important. The near-total collapse of alternative medical education in the United States was not some universal, inevitable consequence of scientific progress that every modernizing nation necessarily experienced in the same way. It was a specifically American outcome, shaped by specifically American institutional conditions, including a level of concentrated private philanthropic capital controlling the financial lifeblood of medical education that simply did not exist in the same form in Germany, India, or most other major nations undergoing their own medical modernization during the same decades. That concentrated private capital is really the thread that ties this entire story together, more than any single villain or any single document. It was not a law passed by Congress that destroyed eclectic and homeopathic medical education in America. It was not even, strictly speaking, the American Medical Association acting entirely on its own authority, though the AMA was certainly an eager and willing partner throughout. It was the simple, structural fact that in early 20th century America, two private individuals, Rockefeller and Carnegie, working through their respective foundations, controlled a level of discretionary philanthropic capital so vast that they could functionally determine which medical schools survived and which did not, simply by choosing where to direct funding, without any democratic process, without any public vote, without any formal accountability to the millions of American patients whose access to different forms of medical care would be permanently reshaped by those funding decisions. There is one more dimension of this story that deserves careful attention, because it intersects with a separate, equally important history that is often overlooked entirely. The medical schools that closed in the wake of the Flexner Report did not affect all physicians equally, and the disproportionate impact fell heavily on women and on Black Americans seeking to enter the medical profession, groups who had found significantly more open pathways into the alternative medical colleges than into the conventional allopathic schools of the era. Before 1910, a number of homeopathic and eclectic medical colleges had been notably more willing to admit women as students than most conventional medical schools, which frequently barred women entirely or admitted them only in token numbers under significant institutional resistance. The New York Medical College for Women, a homeopathic institution founded in 1863, had trained generations of female physicians at a time when most conventional medical schools simply refused to consider female applicants at all. When the wave of closures following the Flexner Report swept through the homeopathic college system, institutions like this one were caught in exactly the same financial and regulatory squeeze affecting every other alternative medicine school, and many of the educational pathways that had specifically opened doors for women in medicine closed along with them. The Flexner Report itself, separate from its treatment of alternative medicine, also explicitly recommended dramatically reducing the number of medical schools serving Black students, naming only two institutions, Howard University and Meharry Medical College, as worth preserving out of several Black medical colleges then operating, a recommendation that resulted in the closure of institutions that had been training Black physicians specifically because mainstream allopathic schools largely refused to admit them. This means the consolidation of American medicine in the 1910s and 1920s was not simply a story about which medical philosophy triumphed over which other medical philosophy in some abstract battle of scientific ideas. It was also, simultaneously, a story about which doors closed for women and for Black Americans seeking entry into the medical profession during exactly the same years, often through exactly the same institutional mechanisms, funded by exactly the same sources of philanthropic capital. Historians who study this period from a lens focused on race and gender in American medical history have reached conclusions that sit uncomfortably alongside the more celebratory standard narrative of the Flexner reforms as a triumph of scientific modernization, because the same reforms that built the laboratory medicine system we recognize today also measurably narrowed who was permitted to become a physician within that system for decades afterward. Let's turn now to the question that probably brought many of you to this video in the first place. The question that sits underneath every retelling of this history on every corner of the internet where this story gets discussed. Did Rockefeller and Carnegie actually conspire in some deliberate, coordinated, secretive sense to destroy natural medicine specifically in order to create a captive market for pharmaceutical products tied to their other business interests? We have walked through an enormous amount of documented historical fact tonight, and it is worth being completely honest about exactly where that documented fact ends and where speculation, however reasonable, begins. What is documented beyond serious historical dispute? Rockefeller and Carnegie's foundations funded the Flexner Survey and then funded its implementation through targeted grants to schools the survey approved of, while providing no comparable funding to alternative medicine schools. Abraham Flexner had no medical training and was selected in part through a direct family connection to the Rockefeller Institute. The Flexner Report's evaluative framework was explicitly biased toward laboratory-based medicine from its very first pages, treating entire categories of medical practice as illegitimate, regardless of individual institutional quality. The pharmaceutical industry expanded dramatically during exactly the same years that medical education was being restructured around a model that trained physicians almost exclusively in pharmaceutical intervention. Rockefeller's own family fortune derived from petroleum, the same industrial sector that would become a foundational supplier of raw chemical inputs for the pharmaceutical industry over subsequent decades. What remains genuinely speculative, where reasonable historians continue to disagree. Whether the men involved consciously, explicitly intended the destruction of natural medicine as a deliberate strategy to benefit their broader commercial interests, versus genuinely believing, with complete sincerity, that laboratory-based medicine represented objective scientific progress that simply happened to align conveniently with their existing financial interests elsewhere. Whether the outcome would have been meaningfully different if a different set of philanthropists, with different ideological commitments, had funded a similarly aggressive reform of American medical education during the same period. Whether the loss of homeopathic and eclectic medical education represents a genuine tragedy of lost medical knowledge or, as defenders of the reform continue to argue, the necessary and overdue elimination of medical systems that, whatever their cultural and historical significance, lacked sufficient scientific validation to justify their continued central role in American healthcare. Whatever conclusion you personally reach about the motivations involved, the downstream consequences of this transformation reach much further into the present than most people realize, and tracing those consequences forward into the 20th century reveals just how deeply this single decade of institutional restructuring shaped the entire architecture of American healthcare that exists today. The American Medical Association, having emerged from the Flexner era as the dominant, centralized authority over medical licensing nationwide, continued expanding its institutional power throughout the mid-20th century, eventually playing a central role in shaping Medicare and Medicaid policy in the 1960s, in determining which forms of treatment insurance companies would recognize as legitimate and reimbursable, and in establishing continuing medical education requirements that, for decades, were funded substantially by pharmaceutical industry sponsorship. A financial relationship between organized medicine and the pharmaceutical industry, whose roots trace directly back to the same early 20th century consolidation, we have spent this entire video examining. Consider the modern insurance reimbursement system, something every American who has ever visited a doctor has encountered in some form. The reason a visit to a conventional physician is far more likely to be covered by insurance than a visit to a naturopath or an herbalist is not, primarily, a recent decision made by insurance executives evaluating comparative treatment efficacy in some neutral, objective process. It is the direct institutional legacy of a licensing and accreditation system built, beginning in 1910, around the explicit assumption that laboratory-based allopathic medicine was the only legitimate category of medical practice, an assumption baked so deeply into the regulatory and financial infrastructure of American healthcare that unwinding it, even where modern evidence might support broader inclusion of complementary treatment approaches, has proven extraordinarily difficult, because the entire system of licensing boards, insurance reimbursement codes, and legal liability standards that determines what counts as legitimate medical practice in America today was constructed, brick by brick, on the foundation the Flexner Report laid down more than a century ago. This is, in many ways, the truest and most important meaning hidden inside tonight's story. The events of 1910 were not simply an interesting historical episode that resolved itself and faded into the past. They established the basic operating rules for an entire system that still determines, today, which treatments your insurance will cover, which practitioners your state will license to diagnose and treat you, and which categories of medicine the broader culture treats as legitimate science versus unproven alternative practice. Every time you have ever filled out an insurance form, every time you have wondered why your visit to an acupuncturist or a naturopath was not covered the way your visit to a conventional physician was, you have been interacting, whether you knew it or not, with the institutional aftershock of decisions made by men with no medical training, funded by petroleum and steel fortunes, more than 100 years ago. There is a quiet postscript to this story that few people know, and it involves what eventually happened to the handful of natural medicine institutions that managed, against extraordinary odds, to survive the entire purge. The National College of Naturopathic Medicine, founded in Portland, Oregon, in 1956, decades after the worst of the institutional collapse, represents one of the rebuilding efforts that slowly began restoring formal naturopathic medical education in America during the latter half of the 20th century. Today, naturopathic medicine maintains formal licensing in a growing number of American states, though the scope of practice naturopathic physicians are legally permitted varies enormously from state to state, a patchwork regulatory landscape that itself reflects the uneven, incomplete nature of natural medicine's slow, institutional recovery from a collapse that took less than 2 decades to inflict, but has taken nearly a century to even partially reverse. Homeopathic medical education in the United States never recovered anything resembling its pre-1910 scale. There is no equivalent today of the 22 fully accredited homeopathic medical colleges that once trained physicians across the country. What remains of formal homeopathic education in America exists largely through shorter certificate programs, continuing education courses for already licensed physicians wishing to incorporate homeopathic principles into an existing conventional practice, and a small number of international training programs. Since the full degree granting homeopathic medical college, the institution type that once stood as a fully credentialed peer to any conventional medical school in the country, simply does not exist in the United States anymore, more than a century after the last of its kind closed its doors. Let's slow down for a moment and sit with a single, specific scene, the kind of moment that rarely makes it into formal histories, but that captures something essential about what this transformation actually felt like for the people living through it. Picture a small town in rural Indiana in the spring of 1922. The town has had the same physician for 11 years, a graduate of an eclectic medical college in nearby Indianapolis, a man who delivered most of the children currently attending the town's only schoolhouse, who has treated the influenza outbreaks, the broken bones from farm accidents, the fevers and infections that define the daily texture of frontier and small-town medical practice in this era. He is well-known, well-trusted, and by every measure the community can apply, a competent and caring physician. That spring, a letter arrives from the state medical board informing him that his license renewal is now contingent on additional laboratory coursework requirements that did not exist when he was originally licensed, requirements modeled directly on the standards Flexner's report had recommended a decade earlier. He is in his 50s. The nearest institution offering the required coursework is over 100 miles away, in a city he would need to relocate to for months in order to complete it, an impossibility for a man supporting a family and serving as the only physician available to an entire rural community. He writes back, explaining his situation, citing his 11 years of unblemished practice, his hundreds of patients, his standing in the community. The response, when it eventually comes, is polite, bureaucratic, and entirely unmoved. The requirements apply uniformly. There are no exceptions for years of service or community standing. He has 2 years to comply or his license will lapse. We do not know, in most individual cases like this one, scattered across thousands of small towns throughout the 1910s and 1920s, exactly how each story resolved. Some physicians found a way to comply, traveling to complete the required coursework despite the hardship involved. Others simply continued practicing informally, treating patients who trusted them regardless of their formal licensing status, operating in a grey zone of quasi-legal medical practice that existed in many rural communities for years after formal licensure technically lapsed. Still others closed their practices entirely, leaving towns that had relied on them for over a decade suddenly without any physician at all, a vacuum that conventional, Flexner-approved medical graduates who overwhelmingly preferred urban practice near the hospitals and laboratory facilities their training had centered around, were often slow or entirely unwilling to fill. This detail matters enormously, and almost never appears in either the celebratory or the conspiratorial version of this story. The Flexner reforms, whatever their scientific merits, created real, documented physician shortages in rural America throughout the 1910s and 1920s, as the new generation of laboratory-trained physicians concentrated overwhelmingly in cities near major hospitals and research institutions, while the older generation of eclectic and homeopathic physicians, who had often been specifically willing to practice in underserved rural areas precisely because their training had not been built around dependence on expensive urban hospital and laboratory infrastructure, aged out of the profession with no comparable replacement generation behind them. Several state medical boards, and even some contemporary public health officials, raised concerns throughout this period about declining physician access in rural counties, concerns that sit in uncomfortable tension with the standard narrative of the Flexner reforms as an unambiguous improvement in American healthcare quality and access. There is another thread worth pulling on here, because it connects this story to a broader pattern that recurs throughout the history of American industry, a pattern of consolidation that extends far beyond medicine alone. And seeing that broader pattern helps clarify whether what happened to natural medicine in 1910 was truly an isolated, medicine-specific event or simply one instance of a recurring industrial strategy applied across multiple sectors of the American economy during the same general era. The early 20th century in America was, broadly speaking, the age of consolidation. Standard Oil itself, before its court-ordered breakup in 1911, had achieved its dominance not primarily through superior product quality, but through a deliberate, well-documented strategy of acquiring or financially overwhelming smaller competitors, controlling rail transportation rates in ways that made independent refiners economically unviable, and using scale advantages to systematically eliminate the fragmented, competitive market that had once characterized the American oil industry. U.S. Steel, the company Andrew Carnegie sold his own steel empire into in 1901, similarly represented the consolidation of what had once been a competitive, fragmented industry into a small number of dominant industrial giants. The railroad industry underwent comparable consolidation during the same decades, as did meatpacking, as did numerous other major sectors of the American industrial economy. Seen against this broader backdrop, the consolidation of American medical education between 1910 and 1925, from 155 competing medical schools and multiple competing medical philosophies, down to a small number of standardized, laboratory-based institutions controlling licensing and practice nationwide, looks considerably less like a unique, medicine-specific scientific reform and considerably more like the same general pattern of early 20th century industrial consolidation being applied by the very same individuals who had perfected that pattern in oil and steel to the field of medicine itself. This does not prove by itself that medical consolidation was driven by identical motivations to industrial consolidation in oil and steel. Medicine involves human health and survival in ways that distinguish it meaningfully from petroleum refining or steel production, and the scientific arguments for standardizing medical education around rigorous laboratory training carry a legitimacy that arguments for consolidating oil, refining around a single dominant company, simply never had. But the structural similarity in method, identify a fragmented competitive field, use concentrated capital to fund and favor a preferred subset of participants while starving the rest, achieve dominant market position for the favored model within a remarkably short period of time, is impossible to ignore once you have spent any real time studying both stories side by side. The men who reorganized American medicine in the 1910s had spent the prior several decades perfecting exactly this consolidation strategy in completely different industries, and it would be a remarkable coincidence indeed if they simply forgot everything they had learned about industrial consolidation the moment they turned their philanthropic attention toward medical education. Let's turn now to a figure whose story complicates the simple narrative in a different, equally important direction, because not every defender of laboratory medicine during this period was simply an instrument of Rockefeller's financial interests, and understanding the genuine, good-faith scientific case for reform helps prevent tonight's story from collapsing into an oversimplified tale of pure villainy. William Welch, often called the father of American scientific medicine, served as the founding dean of the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, and was, by every account that survives him, a physician of genuine scientific brilliance and sincere dedication to improving patient outcomes through rigorous empirical methodology. Welch had studied in Germany, where the foundations of modern bacteriology and laboratory pathology were being established by figures like Robert Koch and Rudolf Virchow, and he returned to the United States genuinely convinced that American medicine was dangerously behind European scientific standards in ways that were directly costing American lives. Welch's advocacy for laboratory-based medical education was not, by any reasonable reading of the historical record, primarily motivated by financial considerations tied to pharmaceutical industry interests. He genuinely believed, based on direct observation of how rapidly germ theory and laboratory pathology were transforming patient outcomes in the European hospitals where he had trained, that American medical education was failing to keep pace with genuine scientific advancement, and that this failure was costing lives that could otherwise be saved. When Rockefeller's philanthropic apparatus sought a model institution to hold up as the standard for the entire Flexner reform process, Johns Hopkins was a natural choice, not simply because of any direct financial relationship, though substantial Rockefeller funding certainly flowed to the institution over subsequent decades, but because Welch and his colleagues had already, independently, built something that genuinely represented the cutting edge of contemporary medical science. This matters because it means the most intellectually honest version of this story cannot simply dismiss every laboratory medicine advocate of this era as a corporate puppet, even while acknowledging the very real, very documented financial incentives operating in parallel. Some of the men advancing the Flexner reforms, like Welch, were sincere scientific reformers who would likely have pushed for similar changes regardless of who was funding the process. Others, operating within the Rockefeller and Carnegie philanthropic apparatus itself, were making decisions shaped at least in part by financial considerations connected to the broader industrial interests of their patrons. Disentangling sincere scientific conviction from convenient financial alignment in any individual case, a century removed from the events themselves, is simply not possible with the certainty either side of this debate often claims to possess. What we can say with confidence, returning to the through line that connects every thread of tonight's story, is that the outcome, regardless of how mixed or sincere the motivations behind it actually were, produced a result that served Rockefeller and Carnegie's broader financial interests extraordinarily well, while simultaneously eliminating, almost entirely, a category of medical practice that had served roughly 1 in 5 American patients only a decade earlier. Whether you call that outcome a fortunate convergence of sincere science and convenient profit, or a calculated exploitation of sincere science by men who recognized its usefulness to their broader financial interests, the lived experience of the doctors who lost their schools and the patients who lost access to an entire tradition of medicine was identical either way. Let's now look closely at a specific medicinal plant whose story illustrates, in miniature, almost everything we have discussed tonight at the institutional level, because sometimes the largest historical patterns become clearest when you trace a single, concrete example all the way through. Foxglove, the tall purple flowering plant that grows wild across much of Europe and was cultivated extensively in early American gardens, had been used in folk and botanical medicine for centuries before formal science ever validated its effects, employed by herbalists and eclectic physicians alike as a treatment for what was broadly described as dropsy, a historical term covering various forms of fluid retention now understood to often be associated with congestive heart failure. Eclectic physicians in the 19th century had developed detailed protocols for foxglove preparation and dosing, built on generations of accumulated clinical observation, despite not understanding, in modern biochemical terms, exactly why the plant produced the effects it did. They knew empirically, through careful, repeated observation across many patients over many years, that foxglove preparations could strengthen and regulate heart function in patients suffering from certain kinds of cardiac insufficiency, even without the molecular biology to explain the mechanism. This is, in fact, precisely the kind of empirical pattern recognition that eclectic medicine specialized in, building reliable treatment protocols through careful clinical observation even in the absence of full mechanistic understanding, a methodology not fundamentally different in spirit from how much of medicine, including conventional laboratory medicine, has always actually advanced, often using treatments successfully for years or decades before fully understanding their precise biochemical mechanism. When laboratory-based pharmaceutical science eventually isolated and purified the active compounds in foxglove, primarily digoxin and digitoxin, into standardized, patentable pharmaceutical preparations in the early 20th century, the underlying medical insight that this particular plant contains compounds capable of regulating cardiac function was not a new discovery made by laboratory science. It was the chemical isolation and patentable industrialization of a medical insight that eclectic and folk herbal medicine had already established empirically, decades or even centuries earlier, through patient clinical observation rather than laboratory chemistry. Digoxin remains, to this day, a commonly prescribed pharmaceutical medication for certain heart conditions, manufactured and sold by pharmaceutical companies, prescribed exclusively by conventional licensed physicians, regulated as a controlled pharmaceutical substance, requiring precise laboratory-determined dosing. The eclectic physicians who had been using foxglove preparations for the same basic medical purpose, with their own carefully developed dosing protocols built on generations of clinical observation, lost their licensing pathway, their colleges, and eventually their entire professional standing within the same few decades that the pharmaceutical industry was isolating, patenting, and monetizing the exact same underlying botanical insight they had already discovered and were already using to treat patients. This pattern, where eclectic and homeopathic botanical knowledge effectively became raw research material for an emerging pharmaceutical industry that then patented, purified, synthesized versions of compounds the natural medicine tradition had already identified and was already using clinically, repeats across numerous other plant compounds throughout this exact historical period, including quinine derivatives, various opium-derived compounds, and salicylic acid compounds related to aspirin, originally derived from willow bark, a plant medicine that herbalists across multiple cultures had used for pain relief for literally thousands of years before a German chemist working for the pharmaceutical company Bayer synthesized and patented acetylsalicylic acid 1897, just over a decade before the Flexner Report would begin systematically dismantling the very tradition of plant-based medicine that had identified the original therapeutic insight in the first place. It would be easy, sitting here in the dark listening to this story unfold, to walk away believing that everything about laboratory-based medicine was simply theft dressed up as science, and that everything about the eclectic and homeopathic traditions that were destroyed represented some lost golden age of perfect natural healing. Neither extreme survives careful historical scrutiny, and it is worth resisting the pull toward either comfortable narrative before we continue, because the actual truth sitting underneath this story is more unsettled and more interesting than either simplified version. Laboratory-based medicine, whatever its complicated and sometimes troubling institutional origins, produced genuine, undeniable improvements in human health and survival over the course of the 20th century. Antibiotics, developed through exactly the kind of laboratory chemistry research that Rockefeller's institutional vision championed, transformed bacterial infection from a frequent cause of death into a generally treatable condition, saving an almost incalculable number of lives across the past century. Vaccines, surgical techniques refined through rigorous laboratory and clinical research, advanced diagnostic imaging, and countless other genuine achievements of laboratory-based medical science have measurably extended human lifespan and reduced suffering in ways that no honest accounting of this story can simply dismiss or wave away in service of a tidier narrative about corporate conspiracy. At the same time, the eclectic and homeopathic traditions that were destroyed were not uniformly superior, scientifically validated systems unfairly persecuted by a purely corrupt establishment. Homeopathy in particular rests on a foundational principle that increasingly diluted substances become more, rather than less, potent in their physiological effects that has never been satisfactorily explained or validated by modern chemistry or pharmacology, and the overwhelming weight of contemporary controlled clinical research has consistently failed to demonstrate that homeopathic remedies produce effects beyond what would be expected from placebo response alone. This is not a fringe opinion. It represents the considered conclusion of essentially every major national scientific and medical body that has rigorously reviewed the clinical evidence for homeopathy over the past several decades, across multiple countries with very different institutional and financial relationships to pharmaceutical industries. Eclectic medicine occupies a more genuinely contested middle ground, because unlike homeopathy's foundational dilution principle, eclectic botanical pharmacology rested on the much more scientifically plausible premise that whole plants contain biologically active compounds capable of producing genuine, measurable physiological effects, a premise that modern pharmacology has repeatedly validated, as the foxglove and willow bark examples make clear. The genuine scientific question, one that remains legitimately debated among contemporary researchers studying herbal medicine, is not whether plants contain bioactive compounds capable of real physiological effects, since this is now firmly established science, but rather whether treating patients with whole, complex plant preparations containing dozens or hundreds of different compounds interacting in poorly understood combination produces outcomes as reliable, as consistently dosed, and as scientifically predictable as treating patients with single, isolated, purified compounds whose precise mechanism and dosing can be rigorously studied and standardized. This is a genuinely open scientific question in many specific cases, not a settled matter where one side simply possesses the truth and the other simply represents superstition, and any honest version of tonight's story has to hold space for that genuine uncertainty rather than resolving it more cleanly than the actual evidence allows. So where does that leave us? Sitting here a little more than a century after Abraham Flexner stepped off that train in St. Louis with his leather satchel of evaluation forms, perhaps the most honest way to hold this story is not as a simple morality tale with clear villains and clear victims, but as a genuine tragedy in the oldest sense of that word, a situation where multiple legitimate goods came into conflict, where real scientific progress and real institutional capture happen simultaneously, intertwined so completely that separating them cleanly may simply not be possible using the historical evidence available to us. The men who funded this transformation were neither purely cynical profiteers manufacturing a captive pharmaceutical market, nor purely disinterested champions of scientific truth. They were something more complicated. Wealthy men who had built their fortunes through aggressive industrial consolidation, who sincerely believed, as men of their era and their class generally did, that scientific rationalism and industrial efficiency represented the future of human progress, and who applied that belief to medicine using the exact same consolidating, capital-driven methods that had built their fortunes in oil and steel, producing an outcome that simultaneously advanced certain genuine scientific standards, while permanently destroying institutional pathways to forms of medical knowledge that, in at least some documented cases, contain genuine therapeutic value that the laboratory medicine establishment would later quietly rediscover, isolate, and patent for itself. What seems beyond reasonable dispute, after walking through this entire history together tonight, is that the particular form American medicine took over the following century, who gets licensed to treat you, what your insurance will cover, which treatments the broader culture considers legitimate versus fringe, was not the inevitable, neutral outcome of pure scientific competition between different medical philosophies allowed to develop and prove themselves on equal footing. It was substantially shaped, in a relatively brief and historically traceable window of less than 2 decades, by the deliberate funding decisions of 2 private individuals who held no medical credentials themselves, working through philanthropic institutions they completely controlled, implementing the recommendations of a report written by a man who had also never practiced medicine, evaluating schools using a framework that treated entire categories of medical philosophy as inherently illegitimate before any clinical outcome data was ever seriously considered. Whether you walk away from tonight's story believing this represents a justified, if imperfectly executed, modernization of a genuinely chaotic and inconsistent medical education system, or believing it represents one of the most consequential and least examined acts of institutional capture in American economic history, the underlying facts themselves remain the same, sitting there in the historical record for anyone willing to look closely enough to see them clearly. The schools closed. The colleges that survived did so only by abandoning the medical philosophies they had been founded to teach. The pharmaceutical industry that rose during exactly these same years inherited a medical education system trained almost exclusively to prescribe its products, and the men who funded the entire transformation built fortunes in industries whose underlying products would become structurally, materially intertwined with the medical system their philanthropy had just finished reshaping. There is something worth considering about the broader pattern of large-scale private philanthropy itself, separate from the specific question of medicine, because the Flexner Report represents one of the earliest and most consequential examples of a phenomenon that would become increasingly common across American life throughout the 20th century, the use of concentrated private wealth, organized through tax-advantaged charitable foundations, to reshape entire public systems, education, scientific research, public health, according to the priorities and worldview of a small number of extraordinarily wealthy individuals, operating with minimal democratic accountability to the populations whose lives those systems directly governed. This is not, by itself, necessarily sinister. Private philanthropy has funded genuine, important advances across countless fields throughout American history, from public libraries to vaccine research to disaster relief, and most historians would agree that American civic life would be measurably poorer without the contributions of large-scale private philanthropic giving across the past century and beyond. But the Flexner story illustrates something important about the structural risk embedded within this model of social change, a risk that exists regardless of whether any individual philanthropist's motivations are sincere, self-interested, or some complicated mixture of both. When a small number of private individuals control a level of capital vast enough to single-handedly determine which institutions survive and which collapse across an entire sector of public life, the direction of that sector's development becomes substantially shaped by the particular worldview, the particular blind spots, and yes, the particular financial interests of those specific individuals, rather than emerging from a more genuinely pluralistic, democratically accountable process involving the broader range of stakeholders, patients, practitioners, and communities, whose lives that sector actually governs. Rockefeller and Carnegie were, by the standards of their own era and arguably by many contemporary standards as well, sincere believers in scientific progress who genuinely thought they were improving American life through their philanthropic giving. But sincerity of belief does not eliminate the structural problem of unaccountable concentrated power determining outcomes for millions of people who had no voice whatsoever in the decision-making process that reshaped their access to medical care. A homeopathic patient in rural Ohio in 1915, whose trusted family physician's professional pathway was being systematically dismantled by funding decisions made in a New York philanthropic office, had no vote, no voice, and no meaningful recourse in that process, regardless of how sincerely the men making those funding decisions believed they were acting in the broader public interest. This structural pattern, concentrated private capital reshaping entire public systems according to the priorities of a small number of wealthy individuals, with limited democratic accountability to the populations affected, recurs throughout 20th and 21st century American history in forms far beyond medicine alone. From education policy to scientific research funding to public health initiatives, and the Flexner story stands as one of the earliest, clearest, and most thoroughly documented case studies of exactly how this pattern operates in practice, exactly what it can accomplish, both for genuine good and genuine harm, and exactly how difficult it becomes, generations later, to fully untangle which outcomes represented progress and which represented loss, once the institutions shaping those outcomes have become so deeply embedded in the basic architecture of daily life that most people never even think to question how they came to exist in the first place. Let's return, for a moment, to the physical spaces themselves, because there is something quietly haunting about what eventually happened to the actual buildings where these vanished medical traditions once lived and breathed. The Eclectic Medical Institute's main building in Cincinnati, once a bustling campus of lecture halls and dissection rooms and a working clinic treating the city's poor alongside its paying patients, sat increasingly empty through the 1920s and 1930s as enrollment collapsed, until the institution's final closure in 1939 left the building without any purpose at all. Like so many institutional buildings that outlive the institutions they once housed, it eventually passed through a series of other uses entirely disconnected from its original purpose. The specific medical knowledge that had once filled its lecture halls leaving no physical trace beyond the architecture itself, a building that had once been ground zero for an entire system of American medical thought, eventually becoming just another aging structure whose new occupants likely had no idea what had once happened within its walls. Many of the homeopathic medical colleges suffered similar fates, their buildings repurposed, sold, or in some cases simply abandoned and eventually demolished. Their specialized libraries, containing decades of accumulated clinical case records and pharmacological research, often scattered or lost entirely in the process, since no surviving institution had any particular incentive to preserve a body of medical literature that the broader profession had already declared scientifically illegitimate. Historians and medical archivists who have attempted, in more recent decades, to reconstruct a complete picture of what eclectic and homeopathic medical colleges actually taught, how rigorously they actually trained their students, and what their actual documented clinical outcomes looked like, frequently run into exactly this problem: a fragmentary, incomplete historical record, not because the institutions never generated detailed documentation in the first place, but because so much of that documentation was simply discarded, lost, or destroyed in the decades following each institution's closure, when nobody remaining had any institutional reason to preserve it. This creates a particular kind of historical irony worth sitting with for a moment. Modern defenders of the Flexner reforms sometimes point to the relative lack of surviving, rigorous, clinical outcome data from eclectic and homeopathic institutions as evidence that these systems never really developed the kind of scientific rigor their defenders claim. But this argument, however reasonable it might sound on its surface, ignores the fact that the very process being defended is largely responsible for why so much of that documentation no longer exists to be evaluated in the first place. We are, in a very real sense, being asked to judge the scientific legitimacy of systems whose own evidentiary record was substantially destroyed by the same historical process that then used the absence of that evidence to justify its own destruction, a kind of circular historical erasure that should give any careful thinker at least some pause before accepting the simplest version of either side's argument. Some fragments did survive, scattered across rare book collections, medical history archives, and the private libraries of historians who specialize in this particular corner of American medical history, and what those surviving fragments reveal is neither uniformly impressive nor uniformly damning. Some eclectic clinical case records show what appears, even by contemporary standards, to be genuinely careful, methodical clinical observation, tracking patient symptoms and outcomes across treatment courses with a rigor that would not be entirely out of place in a modern clinical case study. Other surviving records show exactly the kind of imprecise, anecdotal reasoning that critics of alternative medicine have always pointed to as evidence of insufficient scientific rigor. The truth, as it so often is in history, sits scattered unevenly across a body of evidence too fragmentary and too thoroughly disrupted by the very process under examination to support any single, fully confident conclusion in either direction. Let's shift our attention now to a question that connects this entire 100-year-old story directly to choices being made in healthcare policy today. Because the tension at the heart of tonight's story, between patentable, industrially scalable medicine and unpatentable natural compounds, never actually resolved. It simply moved, generation by generation, into new arenas. Consider the contemporary debate over dietary supplements, herbal products, and the regulatory framework that governs them in the United States today. Under the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, passed by Congress in 1994 after sustained public pressure from a growing natural health consumer movement, herbal and supplement manufacturers are permitted to sell their products with minimal pre-market safety testing requirements compared to pharmaceutical drugs, but in exchange, they are legally barred from making specific disease treatment claims on their packaging or marketing, restricted instead to vague structure and function language about supporting general health and wellness. This regulatory compromise exists precisely because of the unresolved tension we have spent this entire story examining. A supplement company selling, say, a turmeric extract, cannot legally claim on its label that the product treats inflammation-related joint pain, even if legitimate peer-reviewed research exists supporting exactly that claim, because making a specific disease treatment claim would legally reclassify the product as an unapproved drug, subject to the full, extraordinarily expensive Food and Drug Administration drug approval pathway, a pathway that pharmaceutical companies can afford to pursue, because a successful approval grants them years of exclusive, patent-protected sales revenue, sufficient to recoup the enormous cost of the approval process itself. A natural compound that cannot be patented offers no comparable path to recoup that same regulatory investment, meaning that even when legitimate scientific evidence exists supporting a specific therapeutic use for a natural compound, no company has a sufficient financial incentive to fund the expensive clinical trials required to formally prove that use to the satisfaction of national drug regulators. This is, in essence, the exact same structural problem that doomed eclectic and homeopathic medicine in the 1910s, simply relocated into a different regulatory arena more than a century later. Unpatentable natural compounds remain structurally disadvantaged within a medical and regulatory system built, from its earliest 20th century foundations onward, around a model that financially rewards patentable, exclusively ownable pharmaceutical innovation far more reliably than it rewards natural compounds, regardless of how much legitimate therapeutic value those natural compounds might actually possess. The specific institutional mechanism has changed considerably since 1910. We are no longer talking about funding decisions made by a handful of philanthropic foundations determining which medical colleges survive. We are talking about a complex modern regulatory and patent system whose foundational logic nonetheless still privileges exactly the same category of medicine: synthesized, patentable, industrially scalable pharmaceutical compounds that Rockefeller's philanthropic apparatus first helped establish as the singular legitimate foundation of American medical practice more than a century ago. Understanding this continuity matters enormously for anyone trying to make sense of why certain forms of medical treatment remain difficult to access, difficult to get insurance coverage for, or difficult to find rigorous, well-funded clinical research supporting, even when substantial anecdotal or preliminary scientific evidence suggests genuine therapeutic value might exist. The pattern established in 1910 did not simply produce a one-time historical outcome that resolved itself within a generation. It established an enduring set of structural incentives, woven so deeply into the financial and regulatory architecture of American medicine that those incentives continue shaping which treatments receive serious scientific investigation and which remain perpetually under-researched, more than 100 years after the institutions that first established this pattern made their initial funding decisions. Let's turn now to a darker corner of this history that even many people familiar with the basic Flexner Report story have never fully encountered. Because the campaign against natural and alternative medicine in America did not end neatly with the institutional collapse of the 1910s and 1920s, it continued, in different forms, with different targets, for decades afterward, and tracing this continuation reveals just how deeply the underlying institutional logic established in 1910 embedded itself into the ongoing operation of American medical licensing and professional enforcement throughout the rest of the 20th century. In the 1960s and 1970s, the American Medical Association maintained an internal committee on quackery, an organization explicitly tasked with identifying and combating what the AMA classified as unscientific medical practice, a mandate that extended well beyond the kind of genuinely dangerous, fraudulent practitioners that any reasonable person would want regulators to address, and frequently targeted entire categories of licensed, trained alternative practitioners, including chiropractors, whose entire profession the AMA's Committee on Quackery worked actively and systematically to eliminate through coordinated public relations campaigns, professional boycotts preventing medical doctors from referring patients to chiropractors or collaborating with them in any professional capacity, and sustained lobbying against chiropractic licensing and insurance reimbursement in state after state across the country. This campaign eventually resulted in one of the most significant antitrust lawsuits in American medical history. In 1976, a group of chiropractors led by Chester Wilk filed a federal antitrust lawsuit against the American Medical Association, alleging that the organization had engaged in a deliberate, coordinated conspiracy to destroy the chiropractic profession through systematic boycotts and professional exclusion, not because chiropractic care had been scientifically demonstrated to be ineffective or dangerous, but because it represented unwanted professional and economic competition for conventional medical practice. The case, known as Wilk versus American Medical Association, took more than a decade to work through the federal court system. In 1987, federal judge Susan Getzendana issued a landmark ruling finding that the American Medical Association had indeed engaged in an illegal conspiracy in restraint of trade, specifically designed to eliminate the chiropractic profession, a conspiracy the court found was motivated substantially by economic self-interest rather than by genuine, evidence-based concerns about patient safety. This ruling matters enormously for understanding the full arc of tonight's story, because it represents one of the very few instances where a federal court directly examined, under rigorous legal scrutiny with full access to internal organizational documents and communications, whether organized American medicine's historical campaigns against alternative medical practitioners were genuinely driven by scientific concern or by anti-competitive economic self-interest, and the court's documented, legally binding conclusion was unambiguous. The AMA had knowingly and deliberately conspired to destroy a licensed, professionally organized category of healthcare practice, using its institutional power not primarily to protect patients from genuine danger, but to eliminate economic competition for its own membership, a finding that lends substantial, legally validated credibility to the broader pattern of concern this entire video has been examining regarding the earlier, less directly litigated destruction of homeopathic and eclectic medicine decades before chiropractic became the AMA's primary target. The parallel between the Wilk case and the earlier Flexner-era destruction of homeopathic and eclectic medicine is not a coincidence of similar circumstances arising independently. It represents the same institutional actor, the American Medical Association, employing a strategy it had already refined and successfully deployed decades earlier, simply redirected toward a new category of professional competition once homeopathic and eclectic medicine had already been substantially eliminated as meaningful competitors. The chiropractic profession survived this campaign, unlike most of the homeopathic and eclectic colleges that came before it, in significant part because the Wilk lawsuit succeeded in exposing the campaign's true motivations under the bright legal scrutiny of federal antitrust litigation, scrutiny that simply did not exist, and likely could not have existed under the legal frameworks available at the time, when homeopathic and eclectic medicine were being dismantled half a century earlier. This is, in many ways, the single most important piece of evidence in our entire investigation tonight, and it deserves to be sat with carefully before we move forward, because it transforms this story from pure speculation into something resting on documented legal fact. A federal judge, reviewing internal AMA documents under the rigorous evidentiary standards of federal antitrust law, found as a matter of legal fact that organized American medicine had knowingly conspired to destroy a category of healthcare practice for reasons substantially rooted in economic self-interest rather than patient safety. If this is documented to have happened to chiropractic medicine in the 1960s and 1970s, fought and exposed only because chiropractors had, by that point, organized themselves with sufficient legal and financial resources to mount a decade-long federal lawsuit against the most powerful medical organization in the country, it becomes considerably less speculative and considerably more historically plausible to suspect that similar economic motivations, simply impossible to expose through the more limited legal and investigative tools available in 1910, were also operating, at least in significant part, during the earlier and far more devastating destruction of homeopathic and eclectic medicine. The eclectic and homeopathic physicians of the 1910s and 1920s never had the opportunity that chiropractors eventually found in the 1970s. They never had the chance to mount a coordinated federal antitrust challenge against the institutions destroying their profession, both because the legal antitrust framework that eventually enabled the Wilk case was considerably less developed in 1910, and because the financial and institutional collapse happened so rapidly, within scarcely a single decade, that there was little time or surviving institutional capacity left to organize the kind of sustained, well-resourced legal resistance that chiropractic medicine eventually mounted over a much longer period of gradual institutional erosion, rather than the swift, concentrated collapse homeopathic and eclectic medicine experienced. It is worth pausing to imagine, for just a moment, what might have happened if the eclectic and homeopathic medical associations of 1910 had possessed the same legal tools, the same organizational capacity, and the same historical hindsight that chiropractors would eventually bring to bear against the AMA more than 60 years later. Would a similar antitrust lawsuit, filed in 1915 rather than 1976, have succeeded in exposing the same kind of documented economic conspiracy underlying the Flexner reforms themselves? We will never know the answer to that counterfactual question with any certainty, because the lawsuit that might have provided that answer was never filed. The documents that might have proven or disproven the underlying motivations were never subjected to the same rigorous legal discovery process, and the institutions that might have mounted that legal challenge had already collapsed, in most cases, well before anyone organized enough to attempt it. Let's slow the pace again and return to something closer to pure storytelling, because it is easy, in the middle of a story this layered with institutional history and legal precedent, to lose touch with the human texture that makes this kind of history actually land emotionally, rather than simply informationally. Picture a homeopathic hospital in Boston in the winter of 1918, during the peak of the great influenza pandemic that would eventually kill more Americans than the First World War itself. This particular hospital, like dozens of homeopathic hospitals operating across major American cities at the time, was treating influenza patients using homeopathic protocols alongside basic supportive care, isolation, hydration, fever management, the standard tools available to any hospital of that era, regardless of underlying medical philosophy. There exists a genuinely contested, much debated historical claim, repeated frequently in alternative medicine circles and disputed just as frequently by mainstream medical historians, that homeopathic hospitals reported meaningfully lower influenza mortality rates during the 1918 pandemic compared to conventional hospitals treating similar patient populations during the same outbreak. Some homeopathic physicians and historians of homeopathy point to surviving mortality statistics from a handful of specific hospitals as evidence supporting this claim. Mainstream medical historians and epidemiologists who have examined these same statistics generally argue that the comparison is methodologically unreliable, pointing out that homeopathic hospitals of this era may have treated different patient populations with different baseline health conditions and different severity of illness at admission, making any direct mortality comparison scientifically unsound, without controlling for these confounding variables in ways that the surviving historical records simply do not allow for with any rigor. We are not going to resolve this specific historical dispute tonight. because resolving it would require a level of statistical access to confounding variables that simply does not exist in the surviving historical record from 1918, and any honest telling of this story has to acknowledge the uncertainty rather than confidently declaring a winner in a debate that professional medical historians themselves continue to argue about more than a century later. What we can say is that this specific claim, regardless of how it ultimately resolves under closer statistical scrutiny, became one of the rallying points homeopathic medicine's dwindling defenders used throughout the 1920s and 1930s in their increasingly desperate attempts to argue that their medical tradition deserved continued institutional support and licensing recognition, an argument that, whatever its scientific merits, simply could not overcome the financial and regulatory momentum already arrayed against the entire homeopathic medical college system by the time the 1918 pandemic provided this particular piece of contested evidence. By the time the pandemic had run its devastating course, killing an estimated 50 million people worldwide and perhaps as many as 675,000 Americans, the homeopathic medical colleges that had treated influenza patients during the crisis were already deep into the same institutional decline we have traced throughout tonight's story. Their argument that their treatment approach deserved continued recognition, arriving at a moment when the financial and regulatory machinery determining their survival had already substantially decided their fate. Regardless of whatever clinical evidence their physicians believed they were generating in real time during one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded human history. There is one more thread of this story worth pulling carefully, because it concerns the broader question of how cultural memory itself gets shaped, and who controls the narrative that eventually becomes the accepted, textbook version of historical events like the ones we have spent this entire evening examining. Why, you might reasonably ask, does the standard American history curriculum, the version most people encounter in school if they encounter this period of medical history at all, present the Flexner Report almost entirely as an unambiguous triumph of scientific progress over dangerous quackery, with little to no mention of the institutional capture dynamics, the disproportionate impact on women and black physicians, or the documented later antitrust findings against the same organizational actors involved that we have spent tonight examining in such close detail? Part of the answer lies in something almost mundane, the simple reality that historical narratives tend to be written, preserved, and taught primarily by the institutions that survived a given historical transition, while the perspective of institutions and traditions that did not survive tends to fade from the historical record far more easily, simply because there are fewer surviving institutions with any continued interest in preserving and transmitting that competing perspective forward into subsequent generations. The medical schools, professional associations, and journals that survived the Flexner era naturally became the primary institutional sources, shaping how subsequent generations of medical historians, textbook authors, and educators would come to understand and narrate this period, while the homeopathic and eclectic institutions that did not survive left behind a far thinner, far more fragmentary institutional voice with which to advocate for their own version of these same historical events. This is not necessarily evidence of deliberate, ongoing historical suppression, so much as a structural pattern that tends to recur across many different historical contexts, entirely unrelated to medicine, where the institutions and perspectives that triumph in any major historical transition naturally end up controlling, disproportionately, how that transition eventually gets remembered and taught to subsequent generations, simply because they possess the institutional continuity, the surviving archives, and the ongoing professional interest necessary to shape historical narrative, while defeated or dissolved institutions and traditions typically do not. But understanding this structural pattern does not make its consequences any less real. It means that an entire generation of Americans can grow up learning a substantially simplified, one-sided version of one of the most consequential transformations in their country's healthcare history, not necessarily because anyone is actively conspiring to hide the fuller story from them, but simply because the institutional mechanisms by which historical narrative typically gets preserved and transmitted naturally favor the version of events told by the institutions that survived, over the version that might have been told by the institutions that did not. This is, in some sense, exactly why stories like the one we are telling tonight matter, and why they deserve to be told carefully, with full attention to the genuine complexity and genuine uncertainty involved, rather than collapsed into either an uncomplicated celebration of scientific progress or an uncomplicated conspiracy narrative that ignores legitimate counterarguments. The fuller, more complicated version of this history, the version that holds space for both genuine scientific advancement and genuine institutional capture happening simultaneously, intertwined in ways that resist clean separation even after a century of historical study, is simply more accurate to what the surviving evidence actually supports, even if it offers less narrative comfort than either the textbook version or the conspiracy theory version most commonly encountered in popular discussion of this period. Let's go back, one more time, to the question of what was actually lost, because we have spent considerable time on institutions, on legal cases, on the broader patterns of industrial consolidation, but we have spent comparatively less time simply sitting with the specific texture of medical knowledge that genuinely seems to have disappeared, at least from formal institutional memory, during this transformation. Eclectic physicians maintain detailed protocols for treating conditions using combinations of botanical compounds that, by their own clinical records, produced reliable, repeatable results across many patients over many years. Protocols that, once the colleges teaching them closed and the physicians trained in them aged out of practice, were never subjected to the kind of rigorous modern clinical trial methodology that might have definitively validated or invalidated their effectiveness using contemporary scientific standards. This represents a genuinely tragic gap in modern medical knowledge, regardless of which side of the broader Rockefeller conspiracy debate you ultimately land on. There may well be botanical treatment protocols, developed and refined by eclectic physicians over decades of careful clinical practice throughout the 19th century, that contained genuine therapeutic value our modern medical system has simply never properly investigated. Not because modern researchers lack the scientific tools to study them, but because the institutional knowledge of exactly which protocols eclectic physicians considered most reliable, exactly how they dosed and combined specific botanical compounds for specific conditions, was substantially lost when the colleges that taught and refined this knowledge closed their doors, and their practicing physicians died without adequately transmitting their accumulated clinical experience forward into any surviving institutional framework. Modern ethnobotanists and pharmacologists, studying historical eclectic medical texts, where they survive in rare book collections and the personal libraries of medical history specialists, have occasionally identified specific botanical compounds and combinations that appear, on closer modern scientific examination, to show genuine pharmacological plausibility worth further investigation. Plant compounds whose biochemical mechanisms modern laboratory science can now explain in ways the original eclectic physicians never could, even though those physicians had already empirically identified the compound's therapeutic effect through generations of careful clinical observation. This represents, in a very real sense, a form of scientific archaeology, modern researchers occasionally rediscovering, buried in century-old eclectic medical texts, therapeutic insights that the formal scientific and pharmaceutical establishment had simply never bothered to investigate, because the institutional pathway connecting that historical knowledge to contemporary research funding and academic legitimacy had been severed so completely, so many decades earlier, that most contemporary researchers never even think to look for it in the first place. This is perhaps the most quietly devastating possible conclusion available to us tonight. More unsettling in some ways than any conspiracy narrative, because it suggests that the cost of this historical transformation was not simply institutional or financial. The closing of colleges, the narrowing of professional opportunity for certain physicians, but potentially included a genuine, ongoing cost in unexplored medical knowledge, therapeutic possibilities that may have helped real patients with real conditions, sitting forgotten in rare book collections and fading historical archives, simply because the institutional and financial incentives that determine which medical knowledge receives serious contemporary scientific investigation were shaped, more than a century ago, by men who had every financial reason to favor patentable synthesized compounds over the kind of whole plant botanical knowledge that eclectic medicine had spent the better part of a century carefully documenting before its formal, institutional collapse. There is a final dimension of this story worth examining before we begin moving toward our conclusion, because it concerns the question of what genuine, productive reconciliation between these two medical traditions might actually look like today, more than a century after their institutional separation, and whether anything resembling that reconciliation is actually underway in contemporary medicine. The emergence, over the past several decades, of what is increasingly called integrative medicine, a field attempting to combine evidence-based conventional treatment with selectively validated complementary approaches drawn from herbal medicine, naturopathy, and other traditions that survived the 20th century institutional collapse in fragmentary, marginalized forms, represents one genuine attempt at this kind of reconciliation, though one that remains institutionally modest compared to the scale of what existed before 1910. Major academic medical centers, including some of the most prestigious research hospitals in the country, now maintain dedicated integrative medicine departments and clinics, staffed by conventionally trained physicians who have pursued additional training in areas like acupuncture, herbal medicine, and mind-body therapeutic approaches, attempting to bring at least some of the knowledge base that eclectic and naturopathic medicine once formally cultivated back into a institutionally legitimate, research-validated framework. This represents real, meaningful progress toward repairing at least some portion of what was lost, though it operates at a vastly smaller institutional scale than the parallel medical education system that existed before 1910, and it generally requires that any traditional or natural treatment approach first pass through the same evidentiary gatekeeping mechanisms, the randomized controlled trial methodology developed specifically within the laboratory medicine paradigm that the broader medical establishment has used for the past century to determine what counts as scientifically validated treatment. This creates an interesting, somewhat uncomfortable asymmetry that persists into the present moment. Conventional pharmaceutical treatments are evaluated using a research and regulatory infrastructure built specifically to accommodate patentable, synthesized compounds, an infrastructure whose enormous cost is financially justified by the years of exclusive patent, protected sales revenue a successful drug approval generates. Natural and botanical treatments, lacking any comparable patent-protected revenue stream to fund that same expensive evidentiary process, must instead rely on a much thinner stream of government and academic research funding, philanthropic support, or the occasional pharmaceutical company interest in isolating and patenting a specific active compound once preliminary natural product research has identified it as commercially promising, exactly the pattern we traced earlier with foxglove and willow bark. The fundamental structural asymmetry between patentable and unpatentable medicine, established at the very beginning of this entire historical transformation more than a century ago, continues shaping which treatments receive the kind of rigorous, well-funded scientific investigation necessary to definitively prove or disprove their effectiveness, regardless of how much genuine institutional progress integrative medicine has made in building more constructive bridges between these two long-divided medical traditions over the past several decades. Whether this asymmetry will ever be substantially resolved, whether some future regulatory or financial innovation might eventually create sustainable incentives for rigorous scientific investigation of unpatentable natural compounds at anything resembling the scale the pharmaceutical industry currently applies to patentable synthesized drugs, remains an open question that extends well beyond the scope of tonight's historical examination, sitting instead at the intersection of contemporary healthcare policy, pharmaceutical economics, and ongoing scientific research funding debates that will likely continue evolving for decades to come, shaped, whether anyone fully realizes it or not, by the same basic structural tension that Abraham Flexner's leather satchel first helped institutionalize back in 1910. Let's slow down again and return to the human scale of this story, because there is one more individual whose life sits at the very center of how this entire transformation eventually came to be understood, debated, and remembered, and his story deserves to be told carefully, because it complicates almost every simple version of this narrative in productive, interesting ways. Abraham Flexner himself, the man whose name has become almost synonymous with this entire transformation, lived for many decades after publishing his famous 1910 report, long enough to reflect publicly, on multiple occasions, on what he believed his work had actually accomplished, and his own later reflections do not fit neatly into either the heroic reformer narrative or the corporate puppet narrative that different camps have constructed around him in the century since. Flexner went on to found the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey in 1930, an extraordinarily prestigious research institution that would eventually count Albert Einstein among its most famous resident scholars, a fact that complicates any attempt to dismiss Flexner as simply a corporate instrument with no genuine intellectual or scientific vision of his own. He clearly possessed a sincere, deeply held belief in the importance of rigorous, well-funded scientific and scholarly institutions, a belief that extended well beyond medicine into the broader landscape of American higher education and research, and his later career suggests a man genuinely committed to advancing rigorous intellectual inquiry across multiple fields, not simply a hired instrument executing a predetermined corporate agenda in medicine specifically. At the same time, Flexner never seriously revisited or publicly reconsidered the foundational bias against entire categories of medical practice, homeopathy, and eclectic botanical medicine specifically, that had shaped his 1910 report from its very first pages. In his later writings and reflections on the report, he continued defending its fundamental premises, the absolute centrality of laboratory science to legitimate medical practice, without ever substantially engaging with the more complicated counter-arguments that contemporary historians, examining the same period with the benefit of additional decades of hindsight, have raised about the report's treatment of alternative medical traditions and its disproportionate impact on women and black medical education specifically. This suggests a man whose sincere intellectual commitments and whose historically documented institutional blind spots existed simultaneously, inseparably, within the same person, a combination that, when you stop to think about it, describes a great many consequential historical figures across many different fields, men and women whose genuine intellectual achievements and genuine moral or analytical failures cannot be neatly separated into different compartments, however much we might wish, for the sake of narrative simplicity, that history's most consequential actors divided more cleanly into heroes and villains. Flexner died in 1959, at the age of 92, having lived long enough to watch the medical education system he had helped create become the unquestioned, dominant model not just in the United States but increasingly across much of the developed world, exported through American medical school accreditation standards that other countries increasingly adopted or adapted throughout the mid-20th century. He died, by all surviving accounts, believing sincerely that his life's work had been an unambiguous force for good in American medicine, apparently never seriously grappling, at least not in any surviving public record, with the more complicated, more uncomfortable counter-narrative that this very video has spent the past several hours carefully reconstructing for you tonight. Let's turn now to consider what happened to the broader cultural memory of natural medicine in America during the decades when its formal institutional presence had been reduced to almost nothing, because even as the colleges closed and the licensing pathways disappeared, something of the underlying cultural impulse toward natural healing never fully vanished from American life, surviving instead in forms that operated almost entirely outside the formal medical system the Flexner era had constructed. Rural communities across the country, particularly in regions like Appalachia, the rural South, and parts of the upper Midwest, maintained folk healing traditions throughout the entire 20th century that drew, often without much formal awareness of the historical connection, on exactly the same indigenous and early colonial botanical knowledge base that had once fed into the formal eclectic medical college curriculum before its collapse. Appalachian folk medicine, in particular, preserved a remarkably detailed body of herbal knowledge passed down through families, often specifically through women who served as informal healers within their communities, using plants like sassafras, mullein, and yellow root for various ailments in ways that, when documented by 20th century folklorists and anthropologists studying these traditions, showed clear continuity with both indigenous botanical knowledge and the formal eclectic medical pharmacology that had once been taught in institutions like the Cincinnati Eclectic Medical Institute. This folk knowledge survived not because any formal institution preserved and transmitted it deliberately, but simply because rural families, often lacking reliable or affordable access to conventional medical care throughout much of the 20th century, continued relying on traditional herbal remedies out of practical necessity, passing the knowledge down through direct family transmission in a pattern that predates and ultimately outlasted the entire formal institutional history of eclectic and homeopathic medical colleges we have spent this evening examining. This matters because it reveals something important about the actual resilience and actual fragility of different kinds of medical knowledge transmission. Formal institutional knowledge, the kind taught in accredited colleges with standardized curricula and formal licensing examinations, proved remarkably fragile in the face of concentrated financial and regulatory pressure, collapsing across the entire country within scarcely 2 decades once that pressure was systematically applied. Informal, family and community-based knowledge transmission, lacking any formal institutional infrastructure at all, proved considerably more resilient, surviving for generations in marginalized, underdocumented forms precisely because it never depended on accreditation, licensing, or institutional funding in the first place, and therefore could not be defunded, delicensed, or institutionally dismantled in the same direct way the formal, eclectic, and homeopathic college system was. There is something worth reflecting on in this contrast as we move toward the conclusion of tonight's story, a kind of quiet lesson about where genuine resilience in human knowledge transmission actually tends to reside. The most institutionally impressive, most formally credentialed version of a body of knowledge is not always the most durable version of that knowledge when faced with concentrated, well-funded institutional opposition. Sometimes the humbler, more informal, more deeply embedded version, the kind passed quietly from grandmother to granddaughter in a kitchen, rather than from professor to student in a lecture hall, proves considerably harder to destroy precisely because it never depended on the kind of institutional infrastructure that concentrated capital and regulatory power can so effectively target and dismantle when sufficiently motivated to do so. Let's bring our attention now to the broader question of what this story might teach us about evaluating medical and scientific authority more generally, not in a way that descends into reflexive distrust of all institutional science, which would be its own kind of historical overcorrection just as misleading as uncritical acceptance of every institutional claim, but in a way that holds space for the genuinely difficult, genuinely uncomfortable lesson this particular history actually offers. Institutional scientific authority and genuine scientific truth are not the same thing, even though we often, understandably, treat them as functionally interchangeable in daily life, because doing the work of separating them in every single case would be exhausting and frequently unnecessary. Most of the time, institutional scientific consensus does, in fact, track reasonably well with genuine scientific truth, because the scientific method, imperfectly applied as it always is by fallible human institutions, still tends, over sufficient time and with sufficient rigor, to self-correct toward more accurate understanding. But the history we have spent this evening examining demonstrates clearly that institutional scientific authority can, under certain specific conditions, concentrated financial control over the institutions that determine professional licensing and research funding, combined with structural financial incentives favoring certain kinds of findings or certain kinds of treatment approaches over others, become substantially decoupled from purely disinterested scientific evaluation, at least for extended periods, sometimes extended periods lasting many decades, before any correction process, if one ever occurs at all, manages to catch up with and address the underlying distortion. The Wilk versus AMA case demonstrates this with unusual legal clarity in the specific context of chiropractic medicine. The broader Flexner-era history we have spent most of tonight examining demonstrates a parallel, though less directly litigated, pattern in the context of homeopathic and eclectic medicine decades earlier. The lesson here is not that you should distrust medical science generally, abandon vaccination, or pursue unproven alternative treatments instead of evidence-based conventional care for serious medical conditions, a conclusion that would represent a deeply irresponsible misreading of everything we have discussed tonight, given the genuine, well-documented life-saving achievements of laboratory-based medicine over the past century that we have also taken care to acknowledge throughout this story. The lesson, instead, is a more modest, more genuinely difficult one. Institutional scientific consensus deserves serious, substantial weight in how you make medical decisions, because it generally does represent our best collective approximation of currently available evidence. But that same institutional consensus also deserves ongoing scrutiny regarding the financial and structural incentives shaping which questions get asked, which treatments get rigorously researched, and which forms of knowledge get systematically excluded from serious consideration, not because every institutional claim is secretly corrupt, but because history demonstrates clearly that institutional capture by concentrated financial interests has happened before, has been documented in legally rigorous detail in at least one closely related case. and remains a structurally possible outcome anytime enormous concentrated capital intersects with the institutions that determine professional licensing, research funding, and what counts as legitimate medical knowledge in the eyes of the broader culture. Let's take one final detour before we begin our descent toward closing tonight's story, because there is a specific surviving document, one of the relatively few pieces of direct, unfiltered testimony from a physician who lived through this entire transformation firsthand, that captures something the historical statistics and institutional analysis we have covered tonight cannot quite reach on their own. A retired eclectic physician, writing in a small, dwindling professional journal in the early 1930s, reflecting on the collapse of the entire system of medicine he had trained in and practiced for more than 3 decades, described watching what he called the slow death of a science, not through any single dramatic event, but through what he experienced as 1,000 small humiliations accumulated over 20 years, insurance forms that no longer recognized his credentials, younger physicians trained at newly accredited conventional schools, treating him with a kind of polite, condescending pity whenever his name came up in professional gatherings. Patients, increasingly, choosing newly licensed conventional physicians not necessarily because they had been persuaded of any clinical superiority, but simply because hospital privileges, insurance coverage, and the broader weight of cultural legitimacy had shifted decisively against the kind of medicine he had spent his entire adult life practicing. He wrote, in language that historians studying this period have found genuinely moving even a century later, that he did not believe the men who destroyed his profession were evil, exactly, but that he believed they had mistaken the absence of a laboratory for the absence of knowledge, failing to recognize that decades of careful clinical observation passed down through generations of trained physicians constituted a genuine form of scientific evidence, however different in form from the kind of evidence laboratory chemistry could produce. He died, according to the limited surviving record historians have been able to reconstruct, in relative professional obscurity in the mid-1930s, his once respected medical practice having dwindled to a handful of elderly patients who remembered and trusted him from decades earlier, his entire professional world having been systematically dismantled around him within the span of a single career by forces and decisions made in boardrooms hundreds of miles away from the small town where he had spent his entire working life, trying, by his own sincere account, to heal the people who trusted him. This is, in the end, perhaps the truest emotional core sitting underneath everything we have examined tonight, the thing that makes this story worth telling carefully, worth resisting the urge to simplify into either a triumphant tale of scientific progress or a satisfying tale of corporate villainy fully exposed and resolved. It is the story of thousands of individual physicians, individual patients, individual communities who experienced this transformation not as an abstract historical pattern unfolding across decades, but as a lived, often confusing, often painful disruption of medical relationships and medical traditions they had trusted, built, and relied upon, disruptions set in motion by decisions made by men they never met, for reasons that were never fully explained to them, executed through institutional mechanisms, most of them never fully understood, even as those mechanisms were actively reshaping the entire texture of their professional and personal lives. As we begin moving toward the close of tonight's long journey through this history, it is worth taking a moment to gather together the full scope of what we have walked through, because the story has ranged considerably further than its title might have suggested, from a leather satchel on a train in 1910, backward through centuries of indigenous botanical knowledge that predates any of the institutions we have discussed, forward through a federal antitrust courtroom in the 1970s, and finally into the regulatory architecture still shaping which medicines your insurance covers today. This breadth is not an accident of storytelling indulgence. It reflects something genuinely true about how historical transformations of this scale actually work. They are never confined neatly to the specific decade or the specific decision that triggered them. They ripple outward across generations, reshaping institutions and incentives in ways that continue exerting influence long after the original actors involved have died, and the original specific decisions have faded from active public memory. What began as a question about whether 2 wealthy industrialists deliberately destroyed natural medicine schools in 1910 has, by necessity, become a much larger question about how concentrated capital shapes institutional knowledge, about which forms of evidence get taken seriously by powerful gatekeeping institutions, about how quickly an entire branch of professional practice and accumulated clinical wisdom can be dismantled once the financial incentives align against its survival, and about how difficult, even with the benefit of more than a century of hindsight, it remains to cleanly separate sincere scientific conviction from convenient financial self-interest in the minds and motivations of the people who actually made the decisions that produced this outcome. We have tried, throughout tonight's story, to resist the temptation toward either comfortable extreme. We have not told you that Rockefeller and Carnegie were simply villains who knowingly, deliberately conspired to poison American medicine for profit, because the documented historical record, while deeply suggestive and genuinely troubling in its broad pattern, does not contain the kind of unambiguous smoking gun evidence that would allow any honest historian to make that claim with full certainty. But we have also not told you that the Flexner Report was simply an unambiguous, uncomplicated triumph of scientific progress over superstition, because the documented historical record, including a federal court's own legally binding finding regarding a closely related campaign against chiropractic medicine decades later, makes that simpler, more comfortable narrative equally difficult to accept without serious reservation. What we have tried to give you instead, across these many hours, is the fuller texture of a genuinely complicated historical transformation, one where real scientific progress and real institutional capture appear to have happened simultaneously, intertwined so completely within the same decisions, the same institutions, and often the same individual human beings, that separating them cleanly into distinct categories of pure good and pure harm may simply not be possible, however much both the celebratory textbook narrative and the conspiracy theory narrative each try, in their own different ways, to offer you that comforting simplicity. Let's pause here for a moment and return to something gentler before we continue further, because it is worth remembering, even in the middle of a story this heavy with institutional history and contested motivation, that the underlying human impulse this entire saga revolves around, the desire to heal, to understand the body, to find reliable methods for relieving suffering, is one of the oldest and most universally shared human impulses there is, stretching back long before any of the specific institutions we have discussed tonight existed, and continuing forward, in countless different forms across countless different cultures, long after any single chapter of this particular American story reaches its conclusion. Every tradition we have discussed tonight, the indigenous botanical knowledge that predates European contact by thousands of years, the eclectic and homeopathic colleges that flourished briefly across 19th century America, the laboratory-based medicine that eventually displaced them, the chiropractic and naturopathic traditions that fought their way back toward institutional legitimacy in the latter half of the 20th century, and the integrative medicine movements attempting some form of reconciliation today, all of them represent different generations of people pursuing the exact same fundamental goal, trying to understand how the human body works and how to help it heal when something goes wrong. The specific methods, the specific institutions, the specific financial and political forces shaping which methods received institutional support in any given era, all of that has shifted dramatically across the decades and centuries we have covered tonight. But the underlying human motivation driving every single person involved in this story, the eclectic physicians who spent their careers documenting plant pharmacology, the laboratory researchers who isolated and synthesized digoxin from foxglove, the chiropractors who fought a decade-long legal battle for professional survival, the rural grandmothers quietly passing herbal knowledge down to their granddaughters in kitchens far from any formal medical institution, has remained essentially constant across this entire span of history. This is worth holding on to as we move toward the conclusion of tonight's story, because it offers a kind of quiet comfort that neither the triumphant scientific progress narrative nor the dark conspiracy narrative quite manages to provide on its own. Whatever institutional capture occurred, whatever genuine scientific advancement occurred alongside it, whatever knowledge was lost and whatever knowledge was gained across this long, complicated history, the fundamental human project of trying to understand and heal the body has continued, generation after generation, century after century, surviving every institutional collapse and every institutional consolidation we have discussed tonight, because the impulse driving that project runs deeper than any single institution, any single fortune, or any single historical decade ever could. There is one more major thread to pull before we turn fully toward closing, and it concerns a question many of you listening tonight may already be quietly forming in your own minds. If a small number of extraordinarily wealthy individuals could reshape the entire landscape of American medical education within less than 2 decades a century ago, what does that suggest about the influence concentrated private capital continues to exert over American healthcare, scientific research, and public health policy today, in an era when private philanthropic foundations, pharmaceutical companies, and increasingly large private equity firms hold financial influence over medical institutions, hospital systems, and research funding that, in raw economic terms, dwarfs anything Rockefeller or Carnegie commanded in their own era? This is not a question tonight's video can answer definitively, because evaluating the full scope of contemporary institutional influence over modern medicine would require its own extensive, separate investigation, one that would need to grapple with an enormously complex contemporary landscape involving modern pharmaceutical industry funding of medical research, increasingly common private equity acquisition of hospital systems and physician practices across the country, the continued role of large philanthropic foundations in shaping global public health priorities, and a regulatory and insurance landscape that has grown vastly more complicated than anything that existed in the early 20th century. But the historical pattern we have spent tonight examining in such careful detail offers, at minimum, a kind of cautionary lens through which to view these contemporary developments, a reminder that concentrated private capital intersecting with the institutions that determine medical legitimacy, licensing, and research priority has, at least once before in documented American history, produced outcomes that served the financial interests of the capital holders involved at least as reliably as it served the disinterested advancement of medical science and patient welfare. Whether you find that historical reminder reassuring, in the sense that institutional self-correction mechanisms like the Wilk antitrust case eventually did expose at least one closely related instance of documented anti-competitive conspiracy within organized medicine, or unsettling, in the sense that the original Flexner-era transformation itself was never subjected to anything resembling that same rigorous legal scrutiny, and therefore never received any comparable formal correction or acknowledgement, likely depends on your own broader disposition toward institutional power and concentrated wealth. A disposition this single video certainly cannot resolve for you, and would not presume to try. What this story can offer you, regardless of where you land on that broader question, is simply a fuller, more carefully examined understanding of one specific, well-documented historical episode, the systematic transformation of American medical education between 1900 and 1925, an episode whose consequences continue shaping the basic architecture of American healthcare more than a century later, whether most people encountering that healthcare system today have ever heard the names Flexner, Rockefeller, or Carnegie, or whether, as is true for the overwhelming majority of patients filling out insurance forms and choosing physicians today, those names and that history have simply faded into the kind of quiet, invisible institutional background that shapes daily life, precisely because almost nobody remembers, or ever learned in the first place, exactly how it came to be there. Let's drift now toward a final reflection on this story before we let it settle, returning one more time to the man we began with, standing on that train platform in St. Louis in the autumn of 1910 with a leather satchel full of evaluation forms, because there is something genuinely instructive in considering how ordinary that moment must have felt to the people around him at the time. Nobody on that platform, none of the other passengers disembarking alongside him, none of the porters carrying luggage, none of the local St. Louis residents going about their ordinary autumn afternoon, had any way of knowing they were witnessing the early movements of a transformation that would, within less than 2 decades, fundamentally restructure how an entire nation trained its physicians, licensed its medical practitioners, and determined which forms of healing would be considered legitimate science versus dismissed as unproven folk practice for the following century and beyond. This is, in many ways, how the largest historical transformations actually tend to unfold in real lived experience, not through some single, dramatic, instantly recognizable moment that announces itself clearly to everyone witnessing it, but through a long accumulation of individually unremarkable decisions, funding allocations, regulatory adjustments, and institutional choices, each one seeming reasonable, even minor, in isolation, that only reveal their full combined significance many years later Once historians and researchers have had the time and the distance necessary to trace the full pattern, connecting individually small decisions into a genuinely massive collective outcome. Abraham Flexner, walking through medical school hallways with his evaluation checklist, was, in the most literal immediate sense, simply doing his assigned job, visiting schools, filling out forms, writing his eventual report. The full weight and consequence of that seemingly bureaucratic work would only become fully visible decades later, once the schools he had condemned had closed, once the pharmaceutical industry that benefited from his report's recommendations had grown into a dominant economic force, once federal courts had documented, in a closely related case decades afterward, that organized medicine's institutional campaigns against professional competition were sometimes driven by exactly the kind of self-interested motivation that critics of the original Flexner report had long suspected but had never been able to fully prove. There is something worth sitting with in this realization as we move toward closing tonight's story, a kind of quiet humility about how difficult it actually is, in the middle of any historical moment, to recognize which seemingly ordinary decisions, which seemingly routine institutional choices, will eventually prove to be the hinge points around which an entire century of consequence will turn. We are, all of us listening to and telling this story tonight, living inside our own historical moment, surrounded by institutional decisions, funding allocations, and regulatory choices that feel, in this present moment, just as ordinary and unremarkable as Flexner's evaluation visits must have felt to the people around him in 1910. Whether any of today's seemingly minor institutional decisions will eventually prove, a century from now, to have reshaped some equally fundamental dimension of human life in ways we cannot yet fully perceive, is a question none of us can answer with any confidence, but it is a question this particular 100-year-old story leaves us with, quietly, as we finally begin to let it rest. Before we move toward the true closing passages of tonight's story, let's spend a little more time with one final, specific historical thread that ties together several pieces we have already discussed, because it concerns the fate of the actual physical and intellectual property, the formulas, the case records, the accumulated clinical knowledge that the eclectic and homeopathic colleges had spent decades compiling, and what happened to that knowledge in the specific years immediately surrounding each institution's closure, since this period of transition, often lasting only a year or two for any given school, represented the single most consequential window during which this entire body of accumulated medical knowledge either survived in some transmissible form or was lost essentially forever. When a struggling eclectic or homeopathic college finally closed its doors, the disposition of its physical assets followed a fairly predictable pattern across the dozens of similar closures occurring throughout the 1910s, 1920s, and into the 1930s. Laboratory equipment, where it existed at all in these generally less laboratory-focused institutions, was typically sold or transferred to whatever surviving conventional medical school happened to be nearby and interested in acquiring it. Library collections, often containing decades of accumulated clinical journals, pharmacological reference texts, and unpublished case record compilations, faced a much less certain fate. Some collections were donated to surviving university libraries, where they often ended up catalogued, if at all, in obscure special collections sections that few subsequent researchers, operating within a medical research culture that had already decided this body of knowledge held little scientific value, ever had reason to seriously consult. Other collections were simply discarded entirely, considered, by the administrators overseeing each closing institution's final wind-down, to hold no remaining practical or financial value worth the cost and effort of careful preservation. Faculty members, the living repositories of decades of accumulated clinical teaching experience that had never been fully written down in any single comprehensive text, faced their own difficult choices in these final years. Some attempted to transition into teaching roles at surviving conventional medical schools, a path that was available to relatively few, since most conventional schools had little institutional interest in hiring faculty trained in and committed to the very medical traditions the broader Flexner reform movement had explicitly worked to eliminate. Others simply retired from teaching entirely, continuing to practice medicine with their existing patients for as long as licensing requirements allowed, taking with them into eventual retirement and death decades of clinical teaching experience and accumulated practical knowledge that had never been, and at this point in their careers likely never would be, fully documented in any text that might have allowed it to survive their own individual professional lifetime. This pattern, repeated across dozens of institutions over roughly 2 decades, represents what historians of science sometimes call a knowledge extinction event, a moment when an entire body of accumulated practical and theoretical understanding, built up over generations through careful observation and refinement, loses its institutional transmission pathway so completely and so rapidly that the bulk of that knowledge simply fails to pass forward to any subsequent generation in any organized, recoverable form, surviving only in scattered, fragmentary pieces, rare surviving texts, occasional family folk traditions, and the kind of patient historical reconstruction work that researchers studying this period continue to undertake today, more than a century after the knowledge extinction event itself actually occurred. Let's consider, for a moment, how this same pattern of knowledge extinction connects back to the deeper indigenous history we touched on earlier in tonight's story, because the parallel between these two distinct historical episodes, separated by centuries but connected by the same underlying mechanism, is genuinely striking once you have walked through both in careful detail. The destruction of indigenous botanical knowledge across North America, occurring primarily through disease, forced displacement, and violence over the centuries, following European contact, and the destruction of formal, eclectic, and homeopathic medical education in the early 20th century, occurring primarily through financial starvation and regulatory pressure rather than violence, both represent the same fundamental kind of loss, the severing of a knowledge transmission pathway that had taken many generations to build, accomplished within a historically compressed period, far shorter than the centuries of accumulated practice and refinement that had originally produced the knowledge being lost. In both cases, the knowledge that survived did so primarily through informal, family-based, community-embedded transmission, rather than through formal institutional preservation, a pattern that should, by this point in tonight's story, feel familiar rather than surprising. Indigenous communities that managed to maintain cultural continuity despite centuries of external pressure preserved fragments of their original botanical knowledge, primarily through oral tradition within families and tribal communities, the same basic mechanism through which Appalachian folk medicine preserved fragments of eclectic medical knowledge after the formal college system collapsed. In both cases, formal academic and scientific institutions arrived, generations later, to study and document whatever fragments of this knowledge had managed to survive through informal transmission, often only after recognizing, far too late to prevent the original loss, that something genuinely valuable had been allowed to disappear with insufficient institutional effort made toward its preservation while it remained still fully intact and accessible. This recurring pattern, valuable accumulated knowledge surviving an institutional collapse only through informal channels, later partially recovered through painstaking academic reconstruction efforts that can never fully restore what was originally lost, deserves to be recognized as a genuine, recurring feature of how knowledge systems interact with concentrated institutional and financial power across very different historical contexts, rather than as a series of unrelated, coincidental historical accidents, each unique to its own specific circumstances. Whether the mechanism of destruction is violence and disease, as it was for indigenous botanical knowledge across the centuries following European contact, or financial starvation and regulatory pressure, as it was for eclectic and homeopathic medicine in the early 20th century, the underlying pattern, concentrated power, systematically disadvantaging a body of accumulated practical knowledge, it has determined to be inconvenient, illegitimate, or insufficiently profitable, recurs with an unsettling regularity once you begin actively looking for it across the broader sweep of American history. Let's turn now toward beginning the actual descent into tonight's conclusion, though we still have considerable ground left to cover before we reach the genuinely quiet, closing passages of this story, because there remains one more important dimension worth addressing directly, the question of what, if anything, can or should be done today in response to this historical understanding, a question that inevitably arises once you have spent this many hours walking through the full scope of what was lost and why. Some contemporary advocates for natural and integrative medicine argue for a fairly direct kind of historical correction. Increased public research funding, specifically directed toward rigorously evaluating traditional botanical and homeopathic treatment claims using modern clinical trial methodology, treating this as a kind of overdue debt owed to a body of historical medical knowledge that was never given a fair, well-funded opportunity to prove or disprove its own claims using contemporary scientific standards before its institutional infrastructure was dismantled. Others, including many mainstream medical researchers who remain genuinely skeptical of homeopathy's foundational scientific plausibility specifically, while still acknowledging the genuine institutional capture concerns surrounding eclectic botanical medicine more broadly, argue for a more selective approach, directing research funding specifically toward plant compounds and traditional treatment approaches that show genuine preliminary pharmacological plausibility, deserving serious modern investigation, while remaining appropriately skeptical of treatment systems whose foundational theoretical claims have already been extensively tested and have consistently failed to demonstrate effects beyond placebo response across multiple rigorous studies conducted in multiple countries over multiple decades. This distinction matters considerably, and any thoughtful person trying to draw genuine lessons from tonight's story should resist the temptation to treat every tradition we have discussed as equally deserving of contemporary scientific reconsideration simply because all of them suffered under the same broad historical pattern of institutional marginalization. The historical injustice of how these traditions were destroyed, the financial starvation, the regulatory capture, the disproportionate impact on women and black medical education, the documented federal court finding of anti-competitive conspiracy in the closely related chiropractic case, does not, by itself, automatically validate every specific scientific claim these traditions made about their own treatment efficacy. It is entirely possible, and indeed historically accurate, to conclude simultaneously that eclectic and homeopathic medicine were treated with genuine institutional unfairness, rooted substantially in financial self-interest, while also concluding that some, though importantly not all, of the specific medical claims these traditions made have not held up well under subsequent rigorous scientific scrutiny, exactly the kind of nuanced, two-part conclusion that resists the comfortable simplicity either side of this ongoing cultural debate typically prefers. The most intellectually honest path forward, the one this entire video has tried to model throughout its many hours of examination, involves holding both of these truths simultaneously, taking seriously the documented historical pattern of institutional capture and financial self-interest shaping, which medical traditions survived and which were destroyed, while also taking seriously the genuine, separate scientific question of which specific treatment claims, from any tradition, conventional or alternative, actually hold up under rigorous, well-designed contemporary research, refusing to let either truth substitute for or override the other, even though doing so requires tolerating considerably more uncertainty and considerably less narrative satisfaction than either the purely celebratory or the purely conspiratorial version of this story manages to offer. Let's take a final, broader look at the overall sweep of this history one more time before we begin truly settling toward the end of tonight's journey, because there is something worth saying plainly about the strange, recursive nature of how this story has continued generating new chapters well beyond its original early 20th century timeframe. The 1987 Wilk versus AMA ruling did not simply resolve a contained dispute about chiropractic medicine specifically. It established, as documented federal legal precedent, that organized American medicine was institutionally capable of, and had in fact actually engaged in, exactly the kind of self-interested, anti-competitive conspiracy against alternative medical practice that critics of the earlier Flexner-era transformation had long suspected, but had never been able to formally prove within any comparable legal forum. This means that every time someone encounters tonight's story and wonders whether the Flexner-era destruction of homeopathic and eclectic medicine could plausibly have involved similar self-interested institutional motivations, they are not engaging in baseless speculation untethered from any documented historical precedent. They are drawing a reasonable historical inference from a closely related case where the same basic institutional actor, organized American medicine acting through the American Medical Association specifically, was found, under rigorous federal legal scrutiny with full access to internal organizational documentation, to have engaged in exactly this kind of conspiracy against a different category of alternative medical practice several decades later. This does not prove, with absolute certainty, that identical motivations operated in 1910, since each historical episode deserves to be evaluated on its own specific documented evidence, rather than assumed identical, simply because the institutional actors and the general pattern bear strong resemblance to each other. But it substantially raises the plausibility, beyond what pure speculation untethered from any comparable documented precedent could ever achieve on its own, that the broad pattern of institutional self-interest, shaping medical licensing and professional gatekeeping in America, represents a genuine, recurring feature of how organized medicine has operated across multiple distinct historical episodes throughout the 20th century, rather than a single isolated incident, specific only to the particular men and particular decade we have spent most of tonight examining. This recurring pattern, once recognized, changes how we might reasonably approach evaluating institutional medical authority going forward, not by encouraging blanket distrust of medical science as a whole, a conclusion that would represent a serious overcorrection given the genuine, well-documented life-saving achievements of laboratory-based medicine we have acknowledged repeatedly throughout tonight's story, but by encouraging a more historically informed, more structurally aware skepticism, specifically regarding situations where concentrated financial interest and professional gatekeeping authority intersect closely enough that the line between protecting patients from genuine harm, protecting incumbent practitioners from competitive threat, becomes difficult to clearly distinguish, exactly the blurred line that both the original Flexner-era transformation and the later, more thoroughly documented Wilk case against chiropractic medicine each, in their own way, illustrate with unusual historical clarity. There is one more reflection worth offering before we let this story finally begin settling toward its close, concerning the particular emotional texture of learning history like this, late at night, in the quiet, half-awake state many of you listening right now are likely drifting through. Stories about institutional power, about concentrated wealth reshaping entire systems that govern ordinary people's access to healing and care, can land with a particular weight in these quiet hours, a weight that sometimes tips towards something heavier than simple historical curiosity, something closer to a low, persistent unease about how much of the world we live inside was shaped by decisions made by people we never met, for reasons we may never fully understand, through mechanisms most of us never learned to recognize, even as they were actively operating around us. It is worth naming that feeling directly, if it has arisen for you tonight, rather than letting it simply sit there unacknowledged in the dark, because there is a meaningful difference between productive historical awareness, the kind that helps you understand the world more clearly and perhaps engage with it more thoughtfully, and a kind of diffuse, generalized anxiety about hidden forces controlling everything, an anxiety that can feel superficially similar but that tends to produce paralysis and distrust rather than clearer understanding. Tonight's story, for all its genuine complexity and genuine cause for concern about institutional self-interest, is ultimately a story about specific, documented, historically bounded decisions made by specific, named individuals operating within specific institutions, for reasons that, however troubling in places, remain at least partially knowable and partially explicable through careful historical research, exactly the kind of research this video has tried to walk you through across these many hours. This is different from, and considerably more manageable than, a vague, undifferentiated sense that hidden forces control everything in ways that can never be understood or examined. The men who funded the Flexner Report had names, documented financial interests, traceable institutional relationships, and a documented pattern of behavior that careful historians have been able to study, question, and partially verify across more than a century of subsequent research, including the kind of rigorous federal legal scrutiny that eventually examined a closely related case decades later. That is not the same as conspiracy in the sense of an unknowable, unfalsifiable hidden hand secretly controlling events from total darkness. It is history, complicated and genuinely troubling in places, but ultimately a history made by specific human beings making specific choices that we can examine, question, and learn from, exactly as we have spent this entire evening doing together. Let's begin, now, the true descent toward closing tonight's long examination, returning one final time to the broadest possible view of everything we have covered, because the most honest summary of this entire story is also, in its own way, the simplest one available to us, even after everything else we have discussed. In the early years of the 20th century, American medicine existed as a genuinely pluralistic, genuinely competitive landscape, containing multiple distinct medical philosophies, each with its own colleges, its own licensing pathways, its own accumulated body of clinical experience, treating millions of American patients across a country still substantially rural, still substantially dependent on whatever physician happened to be available in any given small town, regardless of which medical college had trained them. Within roughly 2 decades, that pluralistic landscape was replaced by something far more consolidated, far more centralized, and far more closely aligned with the financial interests of an emerging industrial pharmaceutical sector, a transformation accomplished not through any single law or any single dramatic event, but through the patient, deliberate application of concentrated philanthropic capital controlled by 2 men who had built their fortunes in petroleum and steel. Whether you ultimately believe this transformation represented the triumphant arrival of genuine scientific rigor into a previously chaotic profession, or the quiet capture of an entire field of human knowledge by men whose financial interests happened to align conveniently with a particular kind of medicine they chose to fund, the documented historical facts themselves remain exactly the same, regardless of which interpretation you find more persuasive. The schools closed. The pharmaceutical industry rose. The federal courts eventually found, in a closely related case decades later, that organized medicine had indeed engaged in exactly the kind of anti-competitive conspiracy critics of this broader pattern had long suspected. And the basic architecture of American healthcare that exists today, the licensing systems, the insurance reimbursement structures, the cultural assumptions about which forms of medicine deserve to be taken seriously, still bears the deep, largely invisible imprint of decisions made by men who held no medical degrees themselves, working through institutions they completely controlled more than a century ago. This is the story we set out to tell you tonight, and we have tried, across these many hours, to tell it with the full weight of its genuine complexity intact, resisting the comfortable pull toward either a simple conspiracy narrative or a simple progress narrative, because the actual historical record, examined carefully and honestly, simply does not support either comfortable simplification on its own. What it supports instead is something more difficult, more genuinely uncertain in places, and ultimately, perhaps, more valuable precisely because of that difficulty, a fuller understanding of how concentrated wealth, sincere scientific conviction, and structural financial self-interest can intertwine so completely within a single historical transformation that more than a century of subsequent research has still not fully untangled them from each other, and may never fully succeed in doing so. Let's slow all the way down now, because the analytical work of tonight's story is essentially complete, and what remains is the quieter work of letting it settle, the way any long evening of thinking eventually needs to settle before sleep can actually arrive. Think for a moment about the sheer number of lives this single transformation touched, threading outward from one train platform in St. Louis in 1910 into thousands of small towns, thousands of medical practices, thousands of patient relationships built over years and sometimes decades, all of it eventually reshaped by decisions made in offices far away, by men whose faces those patients would never see and whose names most of them never learned. There is something almost unbearably large about that scope when you let yourself actually sit with it, and something almost unbearably small about it too, because in the end it all traces back to a handful of human choices, made by a handful of human beings, each acting on some combination of conviction, ambition, and self-interest that we are still, more than a century later, trying to fully untangle. Picture, one more time, that eclectic physician we spoke of earlier, writing his quiet reflections in a dwindling professional journal in the early 1930s. An old man by then, watching the world he had built his life around fade away around him, still believing, even as it happened, that the knowledge he carried was real, was valuable, was worth defending, even when no one with power was listening anymore. Picture the homeopathic hospital in Boston during the influenza winter of 1918. Nurses and physicians moving quietly between beds, doing the only thing any healer in any tradition has ever really been able to do in the face of overwhelming illness. Showing up, paying attention, trying to help. Picture the Cherokee healer, centuries earlier, teaching a child which root eases fever and which one is poison, passing forward knowledge that would travel, in fragments, through generations and across cultures, into colleges and clinics whose names that healer could never have imagined, before much of that same knowledge eventually slipped quietly out of formal memory entirely. All of these people, separated by centuries, by continents, by completely different systems of belief about how the body heals, were reaching toward the same fundamental human need to understand suffering, to ease it where possible, to pass forward, to whoever came next, whatever pieces of hard-won understanding they had managed to gather in their own short span of years. That impulse did not begin with Rockefeller's fortune, and it did not end when the last eclectic college closed its doors in 1939. It is still here, tonight, in whatever quiet way it brought you to this story in the first place, whether out of curiosity about a conspiracy, or genuine interest in medical history, or simply the need for something gentle and long enough to carry you towards sleep. There is a quiet kind of peace available in finally setting this story down, even with so many of its questions left genuinely unresolved, because not every story needs a clean resolution to be worth telling, and not every historical wrong needs a tidy modern correction to be worth remembering carefully. Some things simply happened the way they happened, shaped by people who are long gone now, and the most honest thing we can do, more than a century later, is hold the full weight and complexity of what occurred without either excusing it entirely or flattening it into something simpler and angrier than the actual evidence supports. The eclectic colleges are gone. The homeopathic hospitals that once dotted every major American city are almost entirely gone too. The men who funded their disappearance are gone as well, their fortunes long since dispersed into foundations and institutions that bear their names but operate, in most cases, with little direct memory of this specific chapter in their own founding history. What remains, scattered and fragmentary, is what we have spent tonight trying to gather back together, not to rebuild what was lost, because that is almost certainly no longer fully possible after this much time has passed, but simply to understand it more clearly than the standard textbook version usually allows. To know that American medicine was not always organized the way it is organized today, that an entire alternative system once existed, served millions of people, and then largely disappeared within the span of a single generation, shaped by forces that were not purely scientific and not purely conspiratorial, but some genuinely complicated mixture of both, sitting there in the historical record for anyone patient enough to look closely. If tonight's story has done anything useful, it has hopefully given you a slightly fuller, slightly more textured understanding of how the medical world around you actually came to look the way it looks. Why certain treatments are covered by insurance and others are not. Why certain kinds of medical claims are considered legitimate science and others are dismissed as unproven folk practice. Why an entire body of accumulated plant knowledge, refined over generations by physicians who genuinely believed in what they were doing, simply vanished from formal institutional memory within the span of a few short decades. None of this needs to change how you make your own medical decisions tonight or tomorrow. It simply offers a little more context, a little more historical depth, the next time you happen to wonder why the healthcare system around you is shaped the particular way it happens to be shaped. Let's add one final piece to the record before we truly let this story rest, because it concerns a question that often arises once people first encounter this history, the question of what eventually happened to the institutions bearing the Rockefeller and Carnegie names, and whether anything in their own subsequent history suggests reflection, regret, or simple continuation of the same basic philosophy that shaped this entire transformation in the first place. The Rockefeller Foundation, formally chartered in 1913 just as the worst of the medical college collapse was accelerating, went on to fund an extraordinary range of global public health initiatives across the following century, including significant early funding for the eradication of hookworm disease across the American South, support for the development of a yellow fever vaccine in the 1930s, and decades of investment in agricultural science that would eventually become known, with its own complicated legacy, as the Green Revolution. None of these subsequent achievements erase or excuse the earlier history we have spent tonight examining, but they do complicate any attempt to view the Foundation's entire subsequent existence as simply a continuation of corporate self-interest dressed up as charity, since many of these later initiatives produced documented, measurable improvements in global health outcomes that even sharp critics of the Foundation's earlier medical education funding generally do not dispute. The Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, the organization that had originally commissioned Flexner's survey in 1908, continued operating as an education-focused research and policy organization throughout the 20th century, eventually becoming closely associated with the development of standardized testing infrastructure that would shape American education far beyond medicine alone, including significant early involvement in establishing what would become the framework for college accreditation standards still recognizable in the American higher education system today. This represents, in its own way, a kind of quiet continuity, the same basic institutional approach, using concentrated philanthropic capital to establish standardized evaluation criteria that then reshape an entire sector of American professional life, applied repeatedly across different fields throughout the 20th century by the same foundational philanthropic apparatus that had first refined this approach in the specific context of medical education we have spent tonight examining. Neither foundation, in any surviving public statement that historians have been able to identify, has ever offered anything resembling a formal reconsideration or acknowledgement of the disproportionate impact the original Flexner-era funding decisions had on homeopathic and eclectic medical education, on women's access to medical training, or on black medical education specifically. This silence is not necessarily evidence of any deliberate, ongoing institutional cover-up, since the individuals who made the original funding decisions died many decades ago, and contemporary foundation staff bear no direct personal responsibility for choices made by their institutional predecessors more than a century earlier. But the silence does mean that this particular chapter of each foundation's own institutional history remains, to this day, something historians and researchers must reconstruct largely from external archival sources, rather than from any internal foundation acknowledgement or institutional reckoning with this specific period of its own founding decades. One last comparison is worth making before we close, because it brings tonight's story full circle back to the deep continental history we touched on near the very beginning. Consider how differently this story might have unfolded if the institutional destruction we have spent tonight examining had targeted, instead, a body of medical knowledge with a single, centralized, well-resourced institutional defender capable of mounting the kind of sustained, legal and political resistance that chiropractic medicine eventually mounted decades later. The indigenous botanical knowledge that fed, however indirectly and however incompletely credited, into the eclectic medical tradition never had any comparable institutional defender at all, because the communities who held that knowledge most completely had already been devastated by centuries of disease, displacement, and violence long before the Flexner Report was ever written, leaving no equivalent of an eclectic medical institute, no equivalent of an American Institute of Homeopathy, no organized professional body capable of even attempting the kind of resistance that, however ultimately unsuccessful, the eclectic and homeopathic colleges did at least attempt during their final declining decades. This means the destruction we have spent tonight examining represents, in the broadest possible sense, simply the final, most recently documented chapter in a much longer story of accumulated loss, stretching back through centuries of disease and displacement that had already eliminated countless tribal nations, countless languages, and countless bodies of accumulated ecological and medical knowledge long before Abraham Flexner ever stepped onto that train platform in 1910. The eclectic and homeopathic colleges that closed in the early 20th century were, in this fuller sense, already operating with a partial, fragmentary inheritance of a much larger body of knowledge that had already been substantially diminished before it ever reached them, meaning that what was lost in 1910 and the years following represents not the singular destruction of a complete body of knowledge, but rather one more layer added to an accumulating pattern of loss that had already been unfolding across this continent for centuries before any of the specific institutions we have discussed tonight ever came into existence. There is, finally, one more small but telling detail worth sharing before we let this story rest completely, a detail that captures, in miniature, the strange way history sometimes loops back on itself across the span of more than a century. In recent decades, several major pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies have invested substantial research funding into what is now called ethnobotanical bioprospecting, the systematic study of traditional indigenous and folk medical knowledge specifically in search of plant compounds that might be isolated, patented, and developed into new pharmaceutical products. Researchers conducting this work frequently travel to remaining indigenous communities around the world, documenting traditional healing practices, collecting plant samples, and screening them for biologically active compounds using exactly the kind of laboratory chemistry methodology that the Flexner-era reforms first established as the singular legitimate foundation of medical research more than a century ago. This represents, in its own quiet way, a kind of full-circle moment in the story we have spent tonight examining. The same basic institutional and financial logic that determined eclectic botanical medicine illegitimate in 1910 because its knowledge existed in clinical case records and accumulated physician experience rather than in laboratory isolated, patentable chemical form, now drives a multi-billion-dollar contemporary research effort to mine traditional and indigenous medical knowledge, specifically for compounds that can be extracted from their original cultural and clinical context and converted into exactly the kind of patentable laboratory product that the eclectic physicians of a century ago were never given the institutional opportunity or financial support to develop using their own traditions on their own terms. The knowledge itself, it turns out, was never really the problem. The problem was always which institutions controlled the capital required to convert that knowledge into something the pharmaceutical industry's patent-driven business model could recognize and reward, a problem that, in its broad outline, remains essentially unchanged from the one this entire story has traced across more than 100 years. It is worth noting, too, that several countries whose indigenous and traditional medical knowledge has become the target of this kind of contemporary bioprospecting have begun pushing back, in recent years, through new international legal frameworks designed to ensure that communities whose traditional knowledge leads to a commercially successful patented pharmaceutical product receive some meaningful share of the resulting profit, an arrangement sometimes called benefit sharing. These frameworks remain unevenly enforced and frequently contested in practice, and they certainly do not undo the deeper historical losses we have traced throughout tonight's story. But they represent at least a partial, modern acknowledgement of the same basic injustice that sat, largely unaddressed, at the center of the original Flexner-era transformation, the injustice of knowledge generated and refined by one group of people being extracted, monetized, and patented by an entirely different group of people who held the institutional and financial power to convert that knowledge into something the broader legal and economic system would recognize as valuable, while the original knowledge holders themselves were left with little institutional power to claim any comparable recognition or reward for their own accumulated contribution. There is a final, quieter irony embedded in this benefit-sharing movement that deserves at least a brief mention before we close, because it concerns the question of who actually qualifies as a recognized knowledge holder under these new international frameworks, and how difficult that question becomes once an institutional knowledge tradition has already been substantially fragmented and dispersed. Exactly the situation facing both indigenous communities whose knowledge networks were disrupted across centuries and the descendants of eclectic and homeopathic physicians whose own institutional knowledge networks were disrupted within a single generation. When a knowledge tradition survives primarily through informal, scattered transmission rather than through any centralized institutional structure, identifying a clear, legally recognizable rights holder to negotiate benefit-sharing agreements becomes genuinely difficult, sometimes difficult enough that pharmaceutical companies engaging in this kind of bioprospecting research simply proceed without any meaningful benefit-sharing arrangement at all, citing the practical impossibility of identifying a clear counterparty, a difficulty that, however practically real, conveniently happens to favor the institutional party holding the greater financial and legal resources in any negotiation, which is, more often than not, the same kind of well-capitalized pharmaceutical institution whose own historical rise this entire video has spent so many hours tracing back to its early 20th century origins. And so, in the end, the question this entire story leaves us with is not really a question about 1910 at all, however much the specific events of that single, consequential year have anchored tonight's long journey through this history. It is a question about now, about whether the same basic structural conditions that allowed two industrialists to reshape an entire nation's medical knowledge within less than 2 decades still exist today, in different form, under different names, waiting quietly for the next moment when concentrated capital and institutional gatekeeping authority align closely enough to reshape, once again, What an entire generation of people will be permitted to believe counts as legitimate healing knowledge, and what will instead be allowed to fade, slowly and largely unnoticed, into the same kind of quiet historical silence that swallowed the eclectic colleges, the homeopathic hospitals, and so much of the older knowledge that came before either of them ever existed at all. Whatever the answer to that larger question turns out to be in our own era, it will not be settled tonight, and it does not need to be settled tonight, because the only task remaining for you right now is the simplest one of all, simply to rest, carrying with you whatever quiet pieces of this long history felt worth holding on to, and letting the rest drift gently away into sleep. Let's add one more thread to this story before we let it rest completely, because it concerns a specific surviving artifact that historians rediscovered only in recent decades, and it offers a small, concrete window into exactly how this transformation felt from the inside, written not in hindsight but in the actual confused, uncertain middle of events as they were unfolding. In a university archive in the Midwest, researchers cataloguing old institutional correspondence in the 1990s came across a folder of letters exchanged between the dean of a struggling homeopathic college and a colleague at a sister institution in a neighboring state, dated across 1912 and 1913, just as the first wave of Flexner-driven closures was beginning to accelerate. The letters were never intended for publication. They were simply two professional administrators trying to understand, in real time, what was happening to the world they had built their careers within, and that very ordinariness is exactly what makes them so revealing. The dean writing these letters expresses, across several exchanges, a growing and genuinely confused frustration, not initially framed as suspicion of any coordinated conspiracy, but as bewilderment at how quickly the ground seemed to be shifting beneath an institution that, by his own account, had operated successfully and respectably for decades. He describes meeting with state licensing officials who, only a few years earlier, had treated his institution as a fully legitimate, fully respected part of the state's medical training infrastructure, and finding those same officials now speaking in noticeably different language, citing the Flexner report by name, using phrases lifted almost verbatim from its harshest passages, phrases the dean notes he suspects these officials had likely never actually read in full, simply repeating language that had begun circulating through professional and legislative circles, as though it were established fact requiring no further independent verification. By his second letter, written roughly a year later, the tone has shifted considerably. He writes, with what reads even now as a distinct note of weary resignation, that he has come to suspect the matter was decided well before any of the affected institutions were given a genuine opportunity to respond or adapt, that the timeline for compliance with new laboratory and infrastructure requirements was simply too short, too expensive, and too specifically modelled on an institutional template his college had never been built to resemble. For any realistic path towards survival to exist within the financial and temporal constraints actually available to schools like his own. He does not use the word conspiracy in these letters. He seems, if anything, reluctant to reach for language that dramatic, perhaps out of professional caution, perhaps out of a kind of stubborn institutional optimism that refused to fully collapse even as the evidence around him kept accumulating. But the pattern he describes, watching in real time, without access to any of the broader historical context we have spent this entire video assembling, matches, with striking precision, the broader institutional mechanism this story has traced across dozens of similar institutions nationwide. This kind of surviving correspondence matters enormously for historians, precisely because it captures something that the official institutional record, the published reports, the legislative testimony, the foundation grant announcements, simply cannot capture on its own: the lived, day-to-day texture of watching an entire professional world shift beneath you, gradually and then suddenly, without any single dramatic announcement ever telling you clearly that this is what is happening, only an accumulating series of smaller bureaucratic frustrations that, only with hindsight, reveal themselves to have been part of something much larger and much more thoroughly coordinated than any single letter writer, living through it in real time, could have fully recognized or proven on his own. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that this particular folder of letters survived at all, given how much surviving documentation from this exact period was lost, discarded, or simply never preserved in any organized archive. It survived, as it turns out, almost by accident, tucked into a box of otherwise unrelated administrative correspondence that a university archivist happened to preserve simply because preserving institutional records was part of her job, with no particular awareness at the time that this specific folder contained anything historically significant at all. It sat there, unread and uncatalogued in any meaningful way, for the better part of 8 decades, until a graduate student researching an entirely different topic in medical history happened to request the wrong box number and stumbled across it by what she later described, in her own subsequent published research drawing on the letters, as pure chance. This is worth remembering the next time you find yourself wondering how much of this broader history remains genuinely unknown to us, not because it was deliberately destroyed or hidden, but simply because the mundane, accidental mechanics of which documents happen to survive and which happen to be lost are themselves a kind of quiet historical force, shaping which stories we are even able to tell in detail and which stories remain permanently out of reach, not through any conspiracy of silence, but through the simple, indifferent passage of time acting on paper, ink, and the unpredictable choices of archivists and researchers working decades and sometimes centuries after the events themselves occurred. We are fortunate, in this one specific case, that an accidental folder of ordinary correspondence survived long enough for someone to recognize its value. We have no way of knowing how many comparably revealing documents from comparably ordinary administrators living through this same transformation in real time did not survive at all, lost not through any sinister act of destruction, but simply through the ordinary, accumulating erosion that claims most paper records eventually, unless someone, somewhere, makes the deliberate choice to preserve them. So here we are, at the end of a very long night's journey through 100 years of medicine, money, and quiet institutional power, and there is nothing more you need to do with any of it right now except let it rest alongside you as you drift towards sleep. You do not need to remember every name, every date, every detail of how the eclectic medical institute closed or how the Wilk case unfolded decades later. You do not need to resolve, tonight or ever, the deeper question of how much of this transformation was sincere scientific conviction and how much was convenient financial self-interest, because even the historians who have spent entire careers studying this period have not fully resolved that question themselves, and probably never fully will. What you can carry forward from tonight, if you carry anything at all, is simply the shape of the story itself. A leather satchel on a train platform in 1910. A man with no medical degree deciding the fate of 155 medical schools. 2 industrialists whose fortunes happen to align, conveniently or not, with the kind of medicine that survived. An entire body of botanical knowledge, stretching back through indigenous traditions centuries deep, through eclectic colleges and homeopathic hospitals, fading slowly out of formal memory while surviving, quietly, in the kitchens and gardens of people who never needed an institution's permission to grow chamomile or pass down a grandmother's recipe for easing a fever. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, real people, real physicians, real patients, simply trying to heal and be healed. The same impulse that brought you here tonight, listening in the dark, letting a long story about the past carry you gently toward rest. If you found something in tonight's journey through this hidden chapter of American history, you can gently tap the like button, just as a small signal that stories like this one are worth making more of. You can leave a comment if something in particular caught your attention, a name, a moment, a piece of this history you had never encountered before, and let me know where in the world you are listening from tonight. I read every comment, and there is something quietly remarkable about picturing all the different places this same 100-year-old story is reaching at this very moment. Someone in Lagos, hearing it at dawn, someone in Sydney, hearing it just before midnight, someone in a small town in the American Midwest, hearing it in a bedroom not far from where some of these very events actually unfolded over a century ago. If you would like to keep exploring these forgotten corners of history with me, you can subscribe so you do not miss the next one. And if you would like to support this channel in a deeper way, there is an optional membership available here on YouTube. Completely up to you. No pressure at all. Simply a way to help keep these long, careful explorations coming for anyone who finds them worth their time. For now, though, none of that needs to happen tonight. You do not need to do anything at all. You can simply let the images settle. A quiet train platform, a satchel of forms, 155 medical schools scattered across a country still young enough to remember its own frontier, a knowledge older than any of them, carried forward in fragments through people who never stopped trying to heal each other, all of it drifting now into the soft, formless place where stories go and the listening mind finally lets go and rests. Wherever you are tonight, whatever time it is where you are listening, you can let your eyes grow heavy now. The story is told. The history will still be here tomorrow, the same way it has been here, quietly, for over a century, waiting for someone to come along and look at it closely enough to see it clearly. For tonight, that someone was you. Rest well.